everyone to Rebel Impact for another video where we talk tactically about Star Wars Destiny. I'm your host, Rebel Gray, and today we are going to talk about the importance of turn sequencing. And who is we exactly? Well, me and my very special guest here to my right, Sugi from Knights of Ren. How you doing, man?
I am very well. How are you doing?
Pretty good, actually. It's a Tuesday night. Had nothing better to do, so we're going to talk to you guys about turn sequencing, apparently, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. This is such a great it's a great concept and topic to touch on because this is outside of understanding your economy in terms of the value of a resource, the value of a card, the value of a damage token. Your economical structure is critical to success, especially in dealing and sustaining your damage. But the way you build that economical structure is inside of your sequencing with your actions, your activations, the cards you play, the cards you discard to reroll, how you interact with your opponent, your table, your board state. And I absolutely love it because this is one of the few things that people really dig deep enough to talk about, because if you understand your economy and your turn sequencing, you're going to do really well and go really far in Destiny or any game for that matter.
Yeah, and we are going to be breaking this down in a lot of different ways in this video, so I hope that you guys really enjoy. It's got a huge cup of water he brought with us.
Brought to you by Star Wars Last Jedi. Go see it in your home theater.
Your home theater, right? Coming to
it just
it's already on Blu-ray, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So before we get into all this crazy turn sequencing stuff, why don't you tell a little bit about yourself for the people who may not know you? I don't know who those people are, but
it's true. That's true.
Maybe
so watching. My name is Sugi. I drink cups of large water and soda and more water just to stay hydrated. Stay hydrated. It's good for you. I wear a pink hat. I play Star Wars Destiny. I do a lot of things. I'm starting to play Magic the Gathering again, play Yu-Gi-Oh! Again, just tons and tons and tons of stuff. So, but me personally, I'm a nerd. I have comic books in my collection. I play PC games. I really want to play Sea of Thieves, but the reviews are not super positive about it. So I'm really
middling.
I want to be like a pirate, go swashbuckle and shoot myself out of cannons and steal your treasure, but
for another day, I guess.
Yeah, I would love to just become a digital pirate, just stab, but you know how that can be. But I mean, on my off time, I spend time with my wife. I have 2 cats. You might see them in the background here somewhere. They're always hiding,
wandering around.
So if I just slump over dead, and you see this cat claw on the back of my neck, what happened.
Yeah, we'll have it on tape because I'm recording all of this, right? So let me say that I'm really glad to be doing this collaboration with you. This is actually the first one that we're ever doing in the channel's history. So this is Rebel Impact's first collaboration, and it was kind of your idea. So, and we've worked together before. I've been on your show a couple times, right? So, what I noticed when I was writing that in the script, I'm like, I've never actually been on the show at the same time that Nick is. So I feel like I'm Nick's backup now. I'm the 5th Knights of Ren. I'm it. That's it. I'm Rick and Todd and you, but when Nick's gone, you call me up. You're like, yo, Nick's gone. We need you in here. Right?
Nick passed out.
It's one of those things I noticed. And you get around because you're on everyone else's shows. You were on Golden Dice Podcast, Pure Sabah. I mean, you're all over the place. You were on Jedi Geek Girl. You were actually the listener's choice to come back on Jedi Geek Girl show. I was like, I lost a vote. Well, damn.
Oh,
I'm watching all of you guys, but you picked well because Sugi's a good guy. I'm used to flying solo on the show, so this is going to be super interesting. We got a lot of things laid out for you guys. We hope that it's going to be educational for those who are looking to learn more about this advanced idea in Destiny, but really all CCGs too, right?
Oh yeah. If you ever look at a Magic player, especially when you have the stack, and if you've never played Magic, essentially the stack is it's a first in first out, first in last out. Yeah. So you put a card on the stack. You do a thing. I play a creature. Then your opponent says, I'm going to counter that creature. Then you say, I'm going to counter the counter. Then they say, I'm going to counter your counter. So then you say, I'm going to make my creature uncounterable. So then they say, I'm going to remove cards from your hand. And so you keep stacking things up. Mm-hmm. So really strong players in Magic understand the meta, the matchups, all that stuff, similar to Destiny. That's not new. But they have a very strong understanding of the rules. They understand the sequencing of events. They understand how cards are going to resolve and how it's going to impact the state of the game, the state of the board, and what that individual player is trying to achieve. So as a player builds the stack, both players are learning each other's intentions, each other's strategies, and they're also getting information about what resources their opponent has available to them, because if you start to pressure your opponent in one direction of countering a spell and they stop responding to the counter, you understand that they can't stop counters.
Right.
So then you can start to pressure damage, you can start to pressure removal, because they've basically shown you their hand and said, I can't stop counter spells, I can't stop damage. So you can begin to push your agenda, your strategy, whatever you want to call it, because they've essentially told you, I have no way to stop you. And sequencing in Destiny is no different. If you begin to sequence for removal, if you begin to sequence towards damage, towards building resources, towards whatever, and you push your opponent in that direction and they stop pushing back, you're beginning to gain valuable information on what they can, what they can't, and how you can start to abuse the situation for your advantage, and they just can't stop you.
Yeah. And we're going to go over all this stuff, too, in a lot of different sections today. But I want to tell you guys, first of all, too, like why we chose this topic, right? Because and for me, it's something that is not talked about a whole lot. The term itself does come up on a couple of shows I listen to. It's like mentioned offhandedly. It gets skirted a lot, moved past. And no one really stops to talk about it. And I think that, oftentimes you need to have an idea about what turn sequencing is to become a better player, to become a super competitive player. You need to understand it. And I also feel that it's just a deep topic that we could go into for a very, very long time. And I don't know how long this video is going to go, but I imagine it's going to be quite a while. So, I hope you guys can sit back and just kind of enjoy some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. So let's go through the summary of goals for the episode, and then we're going to get right into talking about defining the turn sequencing first, right? So we're going to define it first. This is what we're going to do, number one. We're going to talk about some characters whose efficiency can be maximized with proper turn sequencing. We're going to talk about different types of turn sequencing: damage, economy, survival, sustain. You're going to hear a lot of that stuff today. We're going to highlight how different archetypes might approach turn sequencing a bit differently in terms of the mindset. And we're going to wrap it up with some, hopefully, helpful tips for you guys to take home with you. So the disclaimer here is we cannot teach you how to play Destiny like a pro in an hour or however long this is going to run. Our goal is to discuss factors of turn sequencing so that you can then apply that information in your games every time you come to the table, okay?
Yeah.
And it's possible, of course, that we could be overlooking certain things, and we'll be highlighting a bunch of stuff that you might not be considering right now. We're going to try to be as comprehensive as possible, but hey, we're humans, we make mistakes, all that good stuff, right?
Yeah, I think it's most important that whatever resource you use, YouTube, podcasting, articles, it doesn't matter. The person creating that content, the person writing it, cannot make you a better player just by presenting you with the content. Like, you're going to have to read it, analyze it, absorb it, and most importantly, practice it. You're going to have to get out and play games. You're going to have to see the interactions happen in real life or on TTS. You're going to have to see what happens when you make a mistake, when you don't make a mistake. You're going to have to see what happens when you play, your deck versus mill, your deck versus aggro, your deck versus control or mid-range. Like, reading and listening and watching is a very important piece to becoming a good player. But actually, executing those strategies, doing those things over and over and over, is going to make you a significantly better player than just reading. Like, if you took someone who just only read and only watched and only listened versus someone who didn't do any of those things, but all they did was play all the time, every week, every day, they're always in their game store playing, the player is going to be a significantly stronger person in a tournament scene than the person who only listened, read, and watched, because that person didn't get hands-on experience where the player did get the experience. So whatever we do, please, put this into motion, practice, play, go with your friends, find a group, and just be like, I'm going to play this deck over and over and over and over, and you are going to become a significantly better player for doing that.
Mm-hmm. That's what we hope, right? So we're going to try to give you all this information. We'll be right back after the break. So you all know why we wanted to talk about this topic, but some of you may be asking yourselves, well, what the heck is turn sequencing? What have they been talking about for the first 10 minutes of this video? Well, I'm going to let my co-host here tell you what his definition of turn sequencing is. I'm going to put the little bullet points up in the video. Just keep everything nice and neat, all right?
Yeah, keep it short.
Sugi, why don't you tell us, why don't you define turn sequencing for us?
So in the like simplest version, turn sequencing is just the way you sequence your actions. I mean, like it's not going to get much simpler than that. It's just, you do an activation, you reroll your dice, you resolve your dice, you play, an event somewhere in there, you activate your support, blah, blah, blah. Like it's just, how you go from point A to point B and all of the, spaces in between. That's the, layman's terms of turn sequencing. What the high end of turn sequencing is you have your strategy of point A. You start at point A and you have the strategy that you want to get to, which is point B. And getting to point B by trading the least amount of resources for the most impactful, resolutions of the effects of your
outcome,
stuff. Yeah, outcome, whatever you want to say. Like, you want to trade less resources to hurt your opponent more than they traded to hurt you. Because both of you are going to be interacting in terms of damage, disrupt, discard, stuff. So you want to play, like, the best sequencing would be you activate all of your characters, you spend like one resource and one card, or like one resource and like two cards, like you play a 1 resource costing event and a 0 resource costing event. You're able to mitigate all of your opponent's dice, so you deal all your damage, they deal none of their damage, they pitch to reroll, and you're able to mitigate all of their damage away. So they've basically expended all of their actions, all of their physical resource chits, their cards out of their hand, and they've done minimal damage, if anything, and you've maximized everything, and you get to claim the battlefield and start the next round. That would be like maximizing your sequencing, which is pretty impossible, but that's like the best thing you want to do. Is it's a trade of resources. So when you're playing the game, you're going to have to understand how to do that and what capacity your deck can do that.
Right. So what Sugi's talking about is, preparing this strategy initially and knowing that your strategy is moving towards some kind of end goal at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
But along the way, you're going to have to make these course corrections, essentially, where your opponent's going to do something that counteracts what your end goal is being shaped towards. And you always want to make sure that whatever you respond to allows you to keep the advantage going in the game, right? I mean, that's kind of the bullet points sort of thing, what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like what you're saying is like that's very encompassing, and it takes a lot of brain power and a lot of practice in order to be able to turn sequence in the perfect fashion, but also be able to do all these other things and still win the game at the end of the day.
Right. I've done a lot of sports professionally, and I've met a lot of coaches and really nice guys, and all of them have said, like all of the coaches and the people who played for years and years and years, like football. This is the best analogy that really helped me with like my gaming perspective was when you're playing football, every single play that every team ever makes, running the ball, throwing the ball, whatever they're doing, the goal of that play is to get into the end zone and score points.
Right.
And that's baseball, basketball, everything any team is doing is attempting to score a point. And that's exactly what you're trying to do as a player. You're trying to kill your opponent. But if you notice, football is the easiest analogy because there's basically tons of action sequencing.
Yeah.
Like, They make a play. So your favorite team, whatever they are, they throw the ball, action sequence, whatever you want to call it, activated character. They throw the ball, and their guy catches it, wherever it is, whoever it is. But then they get tackled. Okay, well, the course correction there is you didn't get the points you wanted, so you start where your guy got tackled, and you keep moving forward. Mm-hmm. Same thing applies to Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Destiny. You're always going to try to win the game. You're always going to try to deal maximum damage. Whatever your deck is supposed to do, mill them, doesn't matter. But as you play the game, your opponent is going to do something to stop you. You have to make the necessary adjustments to keep on, pushing your win con to win the game.
Right. Yeah, I think you pretty much nailed it right there, That's what we're all going to do in CCGs. It's very similar to sports like that. And I think the knowledge that we're going to talk about in this video is really going to help people figure out perhaps how to do this more effectively than they may be already doing. That's our hope, right? Let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we want to make it simple. Like, we're not going to try and be overly complicated with, terms and math and stats that aren't relevant. Like, we want people of all skill levels to be able to watch this video and understand, like, how to improve their turn sequencing, because that's really what matters most is, players playing the game, not, one person getting just super crazy good and like beating everyone. Like, it's a community game. It's a community effort to work together.
Yep. So the next thing we're going to talk about are some of the elements of turn sequencing. All right, so now that we know what it is, let's talk about the mindset you need to perform proper turn sequencing. And obviously we're going to break this down a lot more as we move forward in the video, but I also know that you had a lot to say about it when we were in the planning stages for this episode. So I wanted to give you a chance to mention anything you might want to as far as the elements of turn sequencing are actually concerned.
There's a lot to consider with turn sequencing. Like when you're looking at turn sequencing, say for a moment, you're playing a game, or you're watching someone play a game is the better way to do it. So, astral project yourself, boop, and you're like observing from above the game. You're like, oh,
okay.
So, or TTS, you can TTS yourself. You're like,
you can bird's eye view it. Yeah.
You're like, I see everything. So in the moment you astral project, and you're just kind of observant of everything, you have a much stronger understanding of the overall game itself. So what I'm trying to say is, a lot of players, as they're playing the game, they get tunnel vision. They're focused on me. My guys are about to die. My cards are limited. My resources aren't enough. My. And they make sequences. They sequence their actions and events based on their personal perspective of what they can see. What you really need to do is take a small moment, take a breath, sip on your giant cup of water, and take a step back and look at the entire game as a whole.
Yeah.
Look at the information that your opponent has given you, both visually, verbally, and non-visually, non-verbally. How many resources do they have? Have they rolled out their characters? Stuff like that. And then consider where you are. How many resources do you have? How many characters have you activated? What dice have you rolled? What faces are showing? And begin to look at the overall picture and how you can push yourself to an advantage, while at the same time forcing your opponent to deal with what you're doing. Yeah. Because if you purely focus on yourself, your board state, just you're probably not impacting your opponent and forcing them to make tough decisions. A lot of great players will activate a heavily loaded character just to try and bait out removal. If your opponent doesn't immediately hit you with a garbage shoot or a flank or an entangle or something like something to get rid of that damage showing, and if your opponent doesn't say, "Going to play this event to remove it," you have just, unless they're for some reason holding that play, you have more than likely, I'm not going to say 100%, maybe 80, 90% of the time, you've just been told by your opponent that you can pretty much roll out your dice unchecked. Because of your sequencing, you've pressured damage, you've gained information, and now you know that you have a much freer space to reroll, modify your dice, and deal more damage than you currently have. If you've maxed out your damage on the dice, you're fine. Resolve your damage and kill somebody. But that's how analyzing proper sequencing can gain you momentum, and it can gain you valuable information that you didn't have previously. If you're just doing random stuff, like say you activate a character with very low damage, that doesn't tell, and you roll out damage, that doesn't tell you that the opponent has removal, because if you're showing 2 damage, one die has 1 melee, one die has 1 melee, it's not in their best interest to use Garbage Shoot. It's not in their best interest to use Entangle or even Easy Pickings to take off 2 damage, especially if it's non-lethal. So you didn't actually obtain anything other than rolling out 2 damage on sticks. You need to gain valuable information. You need to gain valuable board presence, and basically, pull yourself out of you and see what is the overall piecing, what is the overall pie, what's the overall space that you're playing in that moment.
Yeah, and you had said, early on, looking at it like a chessboard, right? And trying to understand the pieces of the game that you can affect and that need to be affected by you, or that can affect you, and stuff like that. And a lot of the bullet points I'm going to throw up are sort of a summary of what Sugi was talking about. But, he was talking a lot about responding to the game state here and how it's important. Looking at your overall strategy and then the situations that you get put in, and remembering that you got to be adaptive. You have to adapt to everything that gets thrown at you, no matter what. And it's not good enough to just be reactive. You also have to be proactive, right? There are a lot of things that you can do in this game to be proactive for removal, right? There are removal supports now. Suppression Field and Honor Guard and things like that are a lot different. Yeah, those are both great cards than using something like a flank, which, you know, he had mentioned before. So there's so much to this topic that I feel like we're going to have to talk about characters a little bit first to understand perhaps that little sort of microcosm within turn sequencing, and then just kind of blow it wide open, you know, near the end of this video. So You ready to talk about some characters then?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's get right onto the characters in a sec. All right, so let's talk about characters, all right? And so, you know, some of these have really interesting abilities, and what I noticed is that the ones that we're all going to talk about are mostly activated abilities. You know, but there's also actions and power actions that need to be considered when you're talking about turn sequencing, and there's actually a pretty good variety of these in the game. So the characters that we're going to show you here are by no means an exhaustive list of every character in the game that has an ability that you can turn sequence properly. I do think it's interesting, however, that as the game has progressed into something like Empire at War and even Legacies, we're actually seeing a lot more activated abilities, which is awesome because it's kind of like, you know, you get to activate and you get to do something else on top of that, and that's awesome. And I mean, not a single one of these characters that we're actually going to talk about here is from Awakenings or Spirit of Rebellion, which is really interesting too when we were sort of talking about the list together. And I think that says something about the evolution of the game. So what do you think?
Well, it is an evolution of the game. I feel like Awakenings and SOR was the starting point. And in any game, you kind of have to start with a baseline. You have to start kind of bridging people into what the game is meant to do. Mm-hmm. So it's not different than any other game ever. Like the starting point, the starting block, the starting set of any game is usually the most fundamentally sound. Like it's safe. Yeah. So everything is simple, everything is clear cut, everything, like when you do this A thing, you get a B thing. So it's like activate Luke. Yep. Draw a card. Activate Vader. Your opponent discards a card. It's very straightforward. And then Spirit of Rebellion built on top of that. And then we started to finally get these more, you know, I guess complicated characters where it's like, you know, and we'll get into them, but like in order to make them work functionally and efficiently, you have to set them up. They don't just show up to the game and go, all right, we're gonna do a thing. Yep. Like they're not simple, but if you can push them outside of their limit, outside of what their card text says, you're going to go so much further in your success rates and having advantages on the board state at any given point in the game. And I think that's good. That's very good.
Oh yeah. And some of the characters we're going to talk about here are clearly more complex than others. Some are very simple. Some are you know,
Jar Jar.
Oh yeah, Jar Jar. When we talk about Jar Jar, the first one we're going to talk about is pretty simple. It's General Riken, and we throw him up here on the screen for you guys. But Riken is interesting because in order to maximize his effect, like Sugi is alluding to, you have to set him up in some way. You know, you need to start your turn or somehow end the previous turn in a sort of a proactive manner, but making sure your characters have shields on them. So Riken can be an option for your first action, right? Mm-hmm. And you need to make sure that happens so that you maximize them, because if you start going a lot of rounds where you're only getting one discard out of them, he's losing a lot of efficiency, and your win con is not moving in the direction that you want to, although, well, maybe it is, just a heck of a lot slower. In fact, half as slow, because you're letting, you know, something's going on with your opponent. You're not protecting your characters with shields enough, or, you know, maybe they're taking down Riken really fast, and they're leaving other characters alone, which is usually preferred, honestly. But what do you think about Riken, Sugi?
So what's actually most interesting about Riken, I feel, is that before you ever start the game, you really want to take the shields. Well, that's not true. You want to heavily consider taking the shields, because
that's a better way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no point in the game where it's like 100% of the time you will take the shields, because if you're looking at someone who has, say, like an Emperor's Throne Room, do I give them their battlefield? Yeah. Because getting 2 shields does potentially mean, you know, 1 to 2 cards off of your opponent's deck, you know, when you start the game. But in the long run, like by turn 5, have you already lost, or at least not necessarily lost, have you put yourself in an advantage? Have you made the game harder? You know, the ability to use that battlefield to make your life miserable. Those 2 shields aren't worth it. Will those 2 shields give you the same benefit as that battlefield being claimed turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, turn 5.
Right.
Depends
Right.
on the battlefield.
And you may have things in your deck that can deal with specials or change the battlefield, like hyperspace jump or new orders. So there's a lot of things to consider as far as General Recon's turn sequencing is. So even though I said it's sort of simplistic in function, there are a lot of metagame considerations that you can bring into the conversation to say, well, yeah, most of the time I do want to take those shields. And most of the time, depending on, I would say most of the time, the way people construct their decks for Recon, they usually have ways to deal with multiple damage dice, getting specials off the table, changing the battlefield. It's just a matter of when you're going to sequence those things into your game, how soon is that going to happen? If it's going to happen in round 2 because you're going to get in a lot of trouble, then okay, maybe you take Emperor's Throne Room and switch it to Jedha or whatever you're running. But if you're not really good on your draws, you don't feel confident about drawing a hyperspace jump, maybe you don't take that risk.
Yeah.
So
Recon's
interesting.
Recon is very interesting. It's one of those things, like, before you even play the game, like, you have to understand, like, the cards in your hand are dictating your sequencing. If you don't have an upgrade, you're not going to be able to sequence Yoda with the Force Meditation to mill heavily. If you don't have the Scrap Heap, you're not going to be able to create a lot of money to pay for all of the removal events or supports, whatever you have in your hand. So, like, you have to understand the 5 cards in your hand are going to very heavily influence how you sequence your stuff.
Right. And which battlefield you choose.
Right. That's very important.
Yeah. Which isn't talked about a whole lot either. I feel like people miss the point a lot. It's basically comes down to, do I take my battlefield because it helps me more than it helps you? Most people say yes or no to that question, and it's very binary, but there's a heck of a lot more stuff you can talk about just within that space itself. But we're talking about turn sequencing.
Yes,
so we're going to stick to that topic.
So going back to actually Recon as a character inside of turn sequencing. So once you picked your battlefield, you've got your cards. Recon is a powerhouse in how you sequence your stuff. You also have cards that can create shields, like Spirit of the Rebellion, Heightened Awareness, whatever you've got. There's a lot of options.
There's tons. Coordination, defensive stand. There's lots.
Yeah,
cautions.
Teamwork, caution. There's a lot of options. So you generally have built your deck to create shields to help bolster Recon to help mill. But if you don't have the shields on, you need to sequence your characters and your dice and your cards, resources to put shields on everybody else. Then you activate Recon to mill, and get the most value out of Recon. However, there are points in the game, and also depending on what you have. So, for example, if you have a support like Your Eyes Can Deceive You on the table, and your opponent rolls out some significant damage or some lethal damage, you probably need to roll out Recon in hopes of rolling a shield on his die. Then you can blank out your opponent's damage that's lethal to keep your guys around longer and hopefully stall out time. Yeah, that's just one of the small ways that sequencing is vastly more important than remove that die. And that's just one instance out of many potential things that could happen in a game.
Sure, yeah. That's a great example of a reactive sort of a concept there with turn sequencing.
Yeah.
So, I didn't think Recon was going to be as complex as we discussed, but I know for a fact that this next one is going to be, and she's been everywhere, all over the place, right? And it's Mother Talzin. She is like all over draft, all over trilogies format, all over standard, right? And she's so interesting because she has this great activated ability, right? She's like this swing character that has control piece built into her activation. She's a great aggro character. She's got a focus on her die, a discard on her die. She kind of does it all. She's like a 5-tool player. It's crazy. And her sequencing is super duper important, right? She's one of the last to roll in, right? Generally speaking, because you want to be able to turn your die to something very good because you've constructed a deck that is all fancy odd cards, right? And you're running out of resources. Or maybe you want to use it against your opponent if you know what their deck archetype is. Maybe you're playing another Talzin deck or something like that. So her sequencing is really interesting, especially when she has a crystal ball on her. What do you think about that, though, Suki? Because I know you've got a lot to say about Talzin.
I love Talzin mirror matches.
She's so good.
It's so brain taxing. You're like,
gosh, yeah.
Do I activate her? Do I pass? Like, I passed with Talzin. I'm like, pass. They're like, why? Well, I don't want to activate her first, obviously. So Talzin is very heavy hitter in terms of your sequencing, because you have, I mean, until further notice, until, you know, the white box set cycles out, which is, you know, Legacies, Wave of the Force, set 6, you have easy pickings. And that is a card you have to respect. I don't care who you are or where you are. That card will murderize you if you goof with Talzin and get greedy. So if you're playing an opponent and they have one resource and a yellow character, just don't use Talzin's effect to flip your dice into the same number and the same value, because it's going to hurt and you're going to feel really bad
every time.
Yeah,
at least twice a game.
Yeah,
but yeah, it's going to hurt you.
So anyways, back to Talzin as a whole. She is absolutely a toolbox character, one of the best. Her effect is just so good. It's so good. I don't think she's unfair. I don't think she's undercosted. She's super squishy. Her effect is really good. Her dice are really good. Everything about her is just really super good. But when you talk about her in the sequencing form, she is a toolbox that basically gives you a lot of options. So this goes back to what I was saying previously about, you have point A, you have point B, and you got to go through all of these things here in the middle to collapse those two together. Mm-hmm. So she allows you to make a lot of course corrections with very little diminishing returns. So in previous iterations of Destiny, like, you would have to pitch cards to reroll, or you'd have to use a focus die to flip into other things. If you build your deck appropriately, Talzin really helps you make those course corrections with very minimal resources spent and very high reward coming out of, you know, the sequencing you take. Yep. So you can potentially use her for damage. You can also roll out Talzin first and then use her effect to flip into a resource to get Maul's Saber on the table, and then you can power action that out immediately if your opponent doesn't have shields. The whole overarching thing about Talzin is you are basically presented with the freedom to do whatever you want to do. So you have to remember to stay focused on point A, point B, because at this point with Talzin, all of these things in the middle become really flashy, and they start to kind of yell and scream at you and talk at you like, you can do this, you can do that, you can do these, you can do, and you have to go, well, I could. I can. And sometimes players get overexcited or they get greedy and they're like, I can do like 4 damage right now. Well, you can, but if they hit you with garbage shoot or easy pickings, you really wasted Talzin. Like, it's very impactful how you sequence her. You could do double resources, and now they have to fear, are they going for a Maul Saber? Are they going for a Vibro Cutlass? And now they're on their back foot because they have to worry, what are they going to do? Yep.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about those advantages of going first in the next section and going second, and sort of what that means in terms of turn sequencing as well.
Yeah. What I am saying is you should look at the dice you're presented with and use them to their most effectiveness humanly possible. I know that's not proper grammar or English, but if you're given...
okay, you're forgiven.
I tell players the best thing to do is not get greedy.
That's one of those pro tips. Right?
In Netrunner, in poker, keep a straight face.
Keep a straight face.
Lie. Yeah. I lie every single game. Anyone who's played me knows I lie like a dog. I'll roll out 2 resources and be like, all right, here comes that heirloom saber. And someone's like, oh no. And then they don't play anything because they're afraid, you know, like, or I'll roll like a focus and the resource. And I'm like, all right, I'll keep that. And they're like, what? Why? Why don't you use Talzin? I'm like, well, because I'm going to take the resource, I'm going to play the heirloom, flip it to the 3, kill your guy. They're like, oh. Now, I could be lying. I might not be lying, but you don't know.
But you don't know.
That's forcing them to make bad sequencing.
Lying is can definitely impact turn sequencing for sure. Yeah. Getting people on their heels can be a really interesting strategy. But
now I will also say
we do have a tip section where that's going to come up.
most professional grade players, the high end players, they probably know you're lying, and they're going to call your bluff and be like, all right, if you got it, do it. So there are times where you probably don't need to or want to lie. That's the caveat. Yeah. But it can be usable. It can be skillful. It can help gain advantage. But the reason I'm saying this is you want to use Talisman's sequencing to force your opponent to make tough decisions.
Tough choices, yep.
Very tough choices. You haven't even resolved a die, and you're sitting on 2 symbols that your opponent really has to think about what are they going to do. And that's what's most important. That's what we're talking about in the turn sequencing of this video. Use your sequencing to gain advantage, to gain a foothold, and to gain information.
Totally. Speaking of liars, our next character, is Rebel Trader, actually, right? You know what? I love Rebel Trader, but he is not getting enough attention right now. This is a super interesting, and I know I say like super interesting, it's really cool, like a lot, but I'm not lying when I tell you this one, because this non-unique yellow character is 8 for 8 points, and he can force your opponent to activate a character as their next action. Like, super interesting little control piece, right?
Yeah.
And sequencing him into your turn appropriately can be devastating to your opponent. And it's just weird that he doesn't get enough play, I think. Like, he's not in a high-level deck right now. He's not meta. But no other character does what he does. Like, he stands alone at what he does. And he could really screw up your opponent's turn sequencing. Like, he single-handedly is the character that's like, I will just activate and screw up your turn. You wanted to put an upgrade on that character that you have there? Nope, not going to happen. Try something else, right?
Yeah. He's really interesting. So he gains way more value the longer the game goes, and the less characters your opponents have. It's not likely they're going to kill him first. I mean, if he's annoying enough, sure, but this isn't the card that's going to be doing the massive damage, doing the impactful plays. So it's more likely he's going to be one of your later characters, and that's when he gets really nasty. I think the further we get into Destiny, Rebel Trader has much more potential, because if we get... He's basically lure on a stick. Like, you just force your opponent to activate. Being able to break up your opponent's turn sequencing is impactful. Against extremely experienced opponents, they know how to get around this, and so it's not as impactful as you want it to be, but it does deflate some of their steam. It's not going to win you the game, but it can set you up to win the game. And that's what's most important, is if your opponent mis-sequences their character activations, or you kill off their best guy, or you kill off their weakest guy, and all they have, like if you're playing like a 2-wide deck, right now in the meta, he's like, we're looking at him for the sake of sequencing your events to mess up your opponent. We're not talking about like his value in the meta or his strength as a character. But what he does is, if I activate him and you have to activate a character, you might have been planning on, I don't know, playing an event.
Playing an event, yeah.
Maybe you wanted to play an upgrade. So what's really nasty with Rebel Trader is if you can get upgrades on him that have disrupt sides, this is where the sequencing really gets very, very nasty. First activation, Rebel Trader, roll him out. If you roll disrupts, you now have those dice on the table, and your opponent has to pass or activate a character, which means those dice are pretty much unchecked. In fact, what's really interesting is Rebel Trader is like a light running interference on a stick.
Yeah, a little bit.
When you activate him, your dice on Rebel Trader aren't going to be mitigated away in the next action.
Right.
At all. They can't do it. So if you put some nasty stuff on him, say you put like a blackmail on him, I mean, if they have resources, they're probably going to pay for it. But if you put like a blackmail on him, if you have things like salvage stand on the table, and you put some things that make resources, once you activate him, you can trigger your salvage stands and eat their resources. And you still have dice sitting on the table they can't respond to. So you're once again pressuring your opponent and forcing them to be on the back pedal, because they can't do what they want to do. They can't play an upgrade. They can't play an event. They have to activate a character. And you know what? They might not want to activate a character because they might have like a flank. Well, if you're trading, if it's a 3-wide versus a 3-wide, or a 2-wide versus a 2-wide, I don't know why you do that. But if you're sitting on equal characters, Rebel Trader turns off flank. It turns off a removal card.
Yep, single-handedly.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of little tricks that get built into his text when you start to look at the greater meta, like the availability of cards and things you might want to be doing. And he just says, well, in a lot of cases, he kind of wins the game, the little mini game that you guys are playing. So I like him a lot. I feel like he's got more potential. Maybe as the block goes on further, or maybe in trilogies, he'll become, in that format, he'll be a little better. I mean, who knows? But he's nothing like the next guy, though. Because Jar Jar Binks is even better than Rebel Trader, despite it not happening when, because someone else can actually choose to do this as well. And I feel like he's, again, another super interesting character that people clearly do not understand how to play against, right? The whole concept of him is a sequence disruption. Like, he says whenever he rolls in, he just screws up the board, and that's just how things go. And a lot of games have been lost, even at regionals. At that's not the highest level of play, but it's a pretty high level of play. People have lost because they don't know how to use Jar Jar against themselves or with the opponent to their advantage, even, because you can use Jar Jar to your advantage. People don't know how to do that. Why is that, Sugi? Why do people screw up Jar Jar? It seems so simple, doesn't it? It's so simple.
Why do you have to say that word?
It seems so simple.
That's such a no-no word in this video.
Listen, just activate Jar Jar first, right? But no, you're right. It's not simple.
When you play, I put my hand in my Napoleon. When you play Destiny, it's simple, super simple.
It's so easy.
No, it's not.
You're right.
Come
It's
on.
not.
It's not. Jar Jar Binks is a curse word I can't say on this show. I choose not to say it. But no. In all honesty, Jar Jar is one of the most interesting in terms of sequencing your stuff. I know on like Knights of Ren we said he's like sound alarm on the stick, but it's much more complicated.
Much more than that. But that's what it comes down to for a lot of players, right?
Yeah.
You put in a mill deck, it is basically sound the alarm on a stick, right? I mean, that's what we look at it as.
So I guess before we really get into it's really funny that Jar Jar brings with him a very deep and intricate discussion.
Yeah, isn't it?
Considering he's got like his tongue's hanging out, he's only got 4 fingers. He's like, like you could just kind of hear the Wilhelm scream coming out of him. He's like,
but he's the worst.
So I'm just going to read a couple things on his cards, just so we're all on the same page here. Any player may take an action to force you to activate this character. That sentence is super duper important for Jar Jar. After you activate this character, reroll all dice, showing a symbol not showing on his character dice. So that's one or both of his. The symbols he has are indirect, discard, disrupt, shield, resource, and a blank. That does count. He has 6 valid symbols.
Yep.
So before you even play the game, when you're running Jar Jar, if you run him at 1 die or 2 dice, that vastly affects his efficiency on the table versus you and your opponent. So if you roll him with 1 die and you activate him, there is a 1 in 6 chance he's going to roll a symbol. So there's 5 other symbols he's going to affect, and because he doesn't have range damage or melee damage, he will always affect those specific symbols. Regardless of what you roll, if there is a melee or range damage showing, he's going to hit it.
Yeah, he will also always reroll specials. Focus as well. He rerolls focus automatically.
That's right. So there's 4. Let's see. I'm pretty sure we covered all those. So.
Yeah, because there's 10 symbols. So that makes sense.
Yeah, there's 10. So of the 10 symbols, he hits 4. That he hits 40% of the dice in the entire game, and he doesn't even have to roll. Like he just basically could just be like,
just
tap
pick him
Jar
up.
Jar. Yeah, activate Jar Jar, reroll those over there. On top of that, he hits whatever he doesn't roll. Now, if you're using him in an offensive manner to try and disrupt your opponent, you want to bring, I think this is right, you want to bring 1 die because he's less consistent.
Yes, I would imagine 1 die. Yep.
If you want to affect your dice less, you want to bring 2 of Jar Jar's dice, because if he rolls a blank and a resource, you don't reroll blanks and resources, you roll everything else. So he has a higher percentage of hitting 2 symbols, which will not reroll the other side. So you can basically, avoid 20% of the damage symbol or the dice symbols in the game, as opposed to 10%.
Yeah, and it will depend strongly on deck construction and die faces that are belong in your particular deck. Like it's gonna vary, right? But that's a good rule of thumb to look at, actually. Yeah, I think the one die causes a bit more chaos. The two die is a limited chaos, but still chaos at the end of the day.
But since nobody wants to hear me talk about math, because let's be honest,
those are other videos that I do. So
nobody cares. Nobody cares about listening to me talk about math. What's most important about Jar Jar is how and when you activate him. So this has happened to me multiple times, and it's actually, believe it or not, helped me win games. Thank you, Jar Jar. So you're sitting at the table. Your opponent has a lot of damage showing or lethal damage showing, and you don't have removal in your hand. Now, this might seem very simple. You might say, well, obviously activate Jar Jar. It is very easy to have tunnel vision when you're playing Destiny. And it's even easier to have tunnel vision when you're staring down a dead character. And you're like, my character is dead. They've got all the damage showing. They're going to kill me. What am I going to do? I don't have removal. I don't have any resources. And they're laughing because they're like, oh, I got him. There's nothing he can do. He's got no cards he can play. There's nothing going on. And you're like, oh, my God, I'm going to die. Do I roll this guy to get shields? Like, do I just sacrifice this character? Knowing, like, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? And a lot of people forget that Jar Jar activates. And then a lot of people forget on top of that, if they're showing lethal damage in ranged or melee, they're going to re-roll it. You're safe. Now, they can re-roll the damage, and they can kill you to the face, and that does happen. But having the Jar Jar re-roll is still better than just letting them resolve the dice and you didn't try. So if you ever see a Jar Jar on the table, like the very first thing I immediately remind myself is if they roll any type of melee damage or ranged damage that I can't deal with out of my hand, activate Jar Jar and try and hit them with a sound the alarm. Worst case scenario, they kill me. Best case scenario, they don't. And if they're showing exactly lethal and it's their like almost max damage, like say the team you're playing against has a max ceiling of 8 damage and they need 7 to kill your guy and they roll 7. Activate the Jar Jar. I mean, even if you have removal in your hand, I would personally activate the Jar Jar because it's very, very unlikely they're going to re-roll into lethal. And then if they don't roll into lethal and they choose to resolve the damage, you still have removal in your hand for the next round. Or if they get greedy and they think, okay, well, he didn't remove my dice, so he must not have removal. And then they try and re-roll, like they discard a card to re-roll. And then they try and roll higher values, and then you hit them with like a garbage shoot and easy pickings. Then they feel really bad. Like, those are those sequencing plays that can be very deceptive because it's easy. Like, as a player, there go my hat, all things. It is like this is one of those gain information pieces of sequencing. So I'm playing against Rebel Grey. He rolls out 6 damage, 2 threes, 3 on this, 3 on that. It's really and that's lethal, but that's his maximum damage. Like, that's his ceiling. He can't roll any higher with everything he's got. It is very easy for me as a player to play easy pickings and guarantee he doesn't kill me. But it is it's risky. It's very risky to activate the Jar Jar, force him to reroll, and then he goes from 6 to maybe 3. He rerolls, instead of 3 and 3, he rolls 1 and 2. That would lead him to believe I don't have removal. So he might get greedy, and this is what you want to do to players with your sequencing. You want to make players get greedy. You want him to think, oh, he doesn't have removal. Well, I'm showing focus. I'm going to use my 2 focus, flip my dice into 6 damage. All right, then you hit him with easy pickings. You got 3 dice off the table. You actually got 4. If he has 2 dice showing focus, and he spends those, and then he flips the other 2 dice into 6 damage, for 1 card and 1 resource, you just pulled 4 dice off the table.
Right.
It's pretty good.
Yep. That's why Jar Jar's amazing. He lets you play mind games on another level that other characters don't let you play. And he's cheap. And that's why he's just so misunderstood. Like, if you want to put Cetus in practice, go and play Jar Jar. Go put him in your deck.
Yeah.
See what he does. Understand and practice what he does. Because on paper, a lot of people were looking at this card when he was first spoiled and saying like, "Oh, Jar Jar is not going to be any good. He's not really that great." He is an amazing card in the right deck, played by the right player at the right time.
Yep.
So there's a lot of tunnels you got to go through to sort of get to where you want to be to maximize him, but it's there. And it's, the game supports Jar Jar in a very good way. And to hear that he can place, top 8, top 4 at a regional, I'm actually not that surprised. Obviously it takes a skilled pilot to get there, but his card text tells you he has a lot to do with turn disruption. A whole lot to do. So,
another thing with Jar Jar, don't underestimate him, but don't get greedy with him, because the same thing can happen to you. If you roll out a character and you've got a lot of sticks or guns showing, it's probably in your best interest to resolve them, because, like I said, he will always affect those. So if you have Jar Jar on your team and you roll out a lot of damage, you should probably expect your opponent to force the activation. Yeah. Because that's the best thing they could possibly do is screw up your die faces for free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They may do that overplaying removal, just like you would use Jar Jar overplaying removal, like in the previous example, right? Yeah. So there's a whole lot to Jar Jar.
There is lots of Jar Jar.
He's a show on his own.
There are a lot of mind games. I've seen really good players use Jar Jar to do so much damage against the person wielding him, and that's really how good turn sequencing can matter. I think the best thing I ever saw once in a game was a player had an Ayla loaded up with sabers, and the first thing they did was activate Jar Jar. And the opponent goes, "Why did you do that?" And he said the exact same thing I did. He was like, "Every single die face on Ayla can get messed up by Jar Jar. So I can't roll her in, get a big blowout number, or even a decent number, and then you just activate Jar Jar, and I'm screwed." So they activated the Jar Jar. They took away any possibility of having their dice mitigated out of their control. Yep. And they forced their opponent to forced the opponent to kind of backpedal, because now they have to play fair. They have to remove your dice with their cards and their resources. Mm-hmm. They have to expend their economy to stop you. Yep. And that's something that you have to consider with a Jar Jar on your table. If you've got a fully loaded up kit on a character, or you've got a bunch of supports that have range damage, maybe activate a support that doesn't have damage. Get a resource. Action stall. We've got action cheating everyone talks about. It's like, but action stalling is a very valid way to sequence your turn.
Totally is.
Roll out the supply line, or I don't know, whatever you've got.
Play a chance cube. Activate a character, bounce a chance cube in your hand, play it again.
Play a chance cube, stall.
Whatever you want to do.
Yeah, let your opponent roll out. Then you activate Jar Jar to screw with them. Then your character dice aren't going to be messed with unless they pay for it. So there's a lot of things to consider with the sequencing of a Jar Jar Binks. Yeah. But it's brilliant. I love how FFG gave us a character.
He's amazing.
He really forces you to think. You have to really consider everything. It's not just activate a character, do some damage. Activate a character, do some damage. It's like, maybe don't do that.
Yeah, because he is a consideration for every player's turn sequencing, and that is super. And there's nobody else like him. No. He is an option for every player on the board. In a multiplayer game, everybody can activate Jar Jar. Someone has to do it, so it becomes really, really interesting.
That is nasty. Very nasty.
Yeah. Everyone's considering Jar Jar. Jar Jar's on everyone's team, essentially.
Jar Jar is like, oh my lord, why?
All right, you want to talk about the next guy?
I absolutely do. So we have another character.
Tarkin.
Tarkin. I love Tarkin. I'm pulling him up right now, so I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, tell me why you love Tarkin, because I haven't played a whole lot with Tarkin, but I understand the importance of sequencing him out to get die faces that you would really like. But how would you explain that to everybody?
Tarkin is, in my opinion, the Yoda of villains. So Yoda does a lot of stuff. He is the now they're not the same. Tarkin is the ultimate toolbox in doing stuff in terms of killing your opponent. So he can deal damage with his indirect sides. He can focus your dice to deal damage. He can eat resources out of the opponent's hand. He can eat cards. So that's options, rerolls, removal, upgrades, whatever he hits, they're gone. He can make money, so he can create resources to help fuel your ramp. He has a blank, but this guy can actually use blanks to his advantage. You can put chance cubes on Tarkin and either make money, or you can create damage. What's interesting and dramatic and exciting is that Tarkin does stuff.
He does stuff.
He does stuff. And I know that sounds simple, but if you really look at him, like, he empowers a lot of really nasty stuff. And he's not terribly expensive. 16 is more than I would want. But what's interesting about Tarkin in the sequencing is he's got a lot of pressure in a lot of places. Now, Tarkin has what Krennic wanted. He's got really random die faces in terms of like consistency. Like, they're not random by any means, but like if you're looking at like an aggro deck, like, you want majority of your dice to be damage. Tarkin is like, I do damage, I do utility, I make money, I can eat cards out of your hand. So he's technically, in that perspective, he's a little all over the place. But you can use that to your advantage, and you can put things on Tarkin like Fragmentation Grenade, where it's 100% indirect damage. So if you roll out indirect damage on Tarkin and, you know, the obvious frag grenade uses power action, remove 2 of your dice. Or you can put 2 fragmentation grenades on Tarkin. You never resolve them because if you roll out 2 of the same symbol, power action. Or if you roll a blank and someone else rolls a blank, power action. And then you can use maybe his focus to flip the fragmentation grenade into 3 indirect. Pay $1. Deal 3 indirect damage. It's not bad. So Tarkin has all of the pieces of the pie that you want. So in terms of sequencing, you have way more flexibility with Tarkin than I personally think any villain character to be threatening regardless of what you roll. So if you roll out non-matching symbols at all, okay, no big deal. No big deal. Because if you roll out threatening symbols, your opponent has to deal with it. If they deal with it with removal, you just got cards and resources off their table. If you roll out 2 of the same symbol, now they have to worry, is he going to power action?
Yep, that's damage. Yeah, he's a great recycler in that sense, right? He takes die maybe that you didn't want, as long as they kind of look the same, and he makes something happen with them.
In the turn sequence discussion that I keep rabbit trailing from because that's what I do, his sequencing punishes you in so many different ways. And a lot of characters don't really do that. They have to have an upgrade or some kind of effect to kind of help. Like Talzin is an aggressive punisher because she rolls out and then she fixes. I call her the fixer of destiny. Like, she fixes your dice to do what you want.
Yeah.
Tarkin's more like the bouncer. So if you think about bouncers, they're more like retroactive. Like, you come into the club, you get drunk, you do something stupid, they kick you out. So Talzin would be like that person. They go into the club, they get drunk, they do something stupid, and then Tarkin shows up and grabs him by the collar and kicks him out. Tarkin just kind of rolls out and sits there and goes, all right, what are you going to do? And you're like, what am I going to do?
Yeah. He's a really great card. Mm-hmm. He's a really great card. Yeah. It's easy to see now why he's so expensive as far as, you know, how much he goes for dollars worth, right?
And what's interesting is the deeper the game goes, the longer the game is played, the more cards that come out. I think he gains more value because if we see more characters with mixed stuff, he can just constantly pressure. Or if we see a character with like a lot of focused sides, say we see like, you like a Luke. We have like 50% shield sides, and then like, I don't know, like a focus and a resource. Say we see the exact same die faces on a villain that we see on Old Man Luke. Mm-hmm. That is still something to be afraid of, because if they can pair with Tarkin, and don't forget, his power action is not an activated, like, you don't activate Tarkin and then do his thing. You can use his power action whether he's activated or not. So if you've got someone with a lot of consistency and low values, say they make a character that's cheap and they've just got a bunch of like 1 values, but it's consistent, like 1 shield, 1 shield, 1 shield. you can roll them out first. And if they roll double shields, well, your opponent now has to consider, are they going to put 2 shields on their guys? Are they going to deal 4 damage to my face? What are they going to, like, do I remove those dice? Do I let them sit there? What do I do? Like, Tarkin just forces your opponent, it forces the opponent to make aggressive decisions, and then you can, like, very retroactively sit there and go, yeah, okay, I'll just play around what you just did.
Yeah, no, he's super interesting in that sense. You know, yeah, he may be one of the more complex one that we talk about as far as impacting how your opponents, because it depends on what he rolls. If he rolls something really good, like, that becomes a conundrum for you to now deal with, right?
And even if he rolls bad, you're like,
yeah,
okay,
bad can become damage for Tarkin.
Chance Cube inherently was like, well, I guess use it for making resources. That's what the card is basically designed to do. Tarkin uses it as economy, as a ramp card, or a damage card.
Or damage card, yeah.
That's the thing. He turns cards and dice into things they were never intended to be.
Yep.
And that's what makes Tarkin so nasty is, and that's a part of your sequencing. If you have a Chance Cube in your hand, you know, do I put it on Tarkin, roll him out, pressure, focus into 3 resources, pressure blanks for damage, pressure he rolls a resource, Chance Cube rolls 1 resource, turn that into 4 indirect damage. Like, there's so many, like, he turns dice into valuable faces.
Yeah, he's that adaptive word that we talked about in the previous section, right? So that's Tarkin for sure.
I love cards in any game that take the game and kind of turn it on its head, because like I said, you're taught to look at blanks and think negatively. Like when we interviewed Lucas on the show, like they use the red purposefully. You want to, like, psychologically, you see the red and you think, oh, negative, bad, ugh, yucky. And Tarkin goes, yeah, okay, I'll use that.
I can use that. Yeah, I can do something with that.
I think it's really good. Like, there's a lot about Tarkin that brings a new perspective to the game that I think is very, very diverse, very interesting, because no one else really does it like Tarkin does. So I'm waiting. I am so waiting for a Tarkin mill deck.
It's out there. It's just not refined yet, but it's out there.
Tarkin mill
better
deck.
Tarkin mill there. All right, so we got 3 more characters to go through. Let's see if we can maybe get through these kind of quick.
These will be a little bit easier, I think.
They are increasing complexity, but I think a lot of the topics or concepts have already been kind of introduced. So let's talk about Sabine, because everyone knows Sabine.
No.
No, you're not talking about Sabine?
No. I don't want to talk about Sabine.
You didn't want to talk about Sabine.
No, I want to talk about Sabine. I love Sabine.
All right, great. So let's talk about Sabine. So Sabine is all about, well, essentially what her turn sequencing boils down to is roll your partner in first, discard a weapon, and try to get that weapon on Sabine and do some ambush plays, right? Everyone who has played against Sabine or is playing Sabine understands that that's at the core concept of her deck in general, right?
Yeah.
What makes that so complicated, though, Sugi?
So if you ever played Magic: The Gathering, and you've ever played Reanimator decks, you know what I'm about to talk about. So Sabine is deceptive because a lot of people think you roll Sabine, Sabine does Sabine things, win the game. Ho-ho! Well, that is not true. Sabine does do Sabine things, a.k.a. she rolls 3s and punches you in the face before you can do anything about it. But what really makes a good Sabine player as good as they are is they understand they have an entirely unique game zone they get to play from that you don't, unless you're playing Sabine. And that is your discard pile. I'm going to call it the graveyard because that's what it is to me, and I'm just going to call it that. So your Sabine players have the deck, the hand, the table, and the graveyard to manipulate cards. You, as the regular player, have the deck, the hand, and the table. So what they're able to do is turn cards from their hand into resources and then reuse them from their graveyard. And you don't get to do that. You just get to use them from your hand, and that's it. They go from hand to graveyard, and that's it. That's all the value you get from the card. So it's like Rebel Gray was saying, you activate Ezra. That's the most common team, Sabine Ezra. Roll out Ezra. Okay, you didn't roll what you wanted. Pitch an upgrade with ambush on it. Sabine is getting ready because you're fueling her power. Ezra rolls. It doesn't even matter what he rolls, because now you've got something incredibly nasty about to happen. Sabine says, before you activate this character, you may play, what play is important here.
Play is important, oh yeah.
You may play a weapon from your discard pile on her, decreasing its cost by 1 if it has the word thermal in its title. The second part of her effect is not very important. Currently, it could be, but what players are really fishing for is ambush cards, because the way ambush works is when a card with ambush is played, play being the keyword, you gain 1 additional action. So, for 1 action, you activate Sabine. Boop. You take your card in the graveyard with ambush, and you attach it to her. You pay their cost. So if it costs 2, you have to have 2 resources. Or you can overwrite and you go, doo -doo. You swap the card that was on her with the new card. So now you have 1 action available. You roll out her dice, you roll out the upgrade dice, and you see what you get. And then you potentially resolve it before your opponent can do anything about it. So you're really hoping to get 2 3s and +2 modified side, or a 3 if you're playing a big heavy hitter. So you're looking at anywhere between 6 to 9 damage. Unmitigatable, unresolvable, anythingable. You're just like, here's damage to the face.
Yep.
So that's why people say Sabine does Sabine things, because she is the only character in the game that can actually do that and potentially roll out significantly high bursts of damage. Going away from strategy and talking about sequencing. Sabine sequencing is simple and complex at the same time. So on the surface, like, if you're looking at the deck, you're like, oh, Sabine wants a bunch of things in the graveyard. She activates, she puts them back on her, rolls out, deals damage. That's the simplicity part. The complex part is actually the toolkit she brings in her deck with running interference. Because you're using Sabine and her activation shenanigans to trigger your running interference to slow your opponent down so that you can resolve your dice at their maximum efficiency and they can't stop you. So you have a lot of things to be aware of when sequencing. What's even more important for the opponent is that you have to be aware of what's in their graveyard. And I know that might sound simple, but a lot of people forget what's in the grave. And as a player, you are more than welcome, and you should, ask to see your opponent's discard pile.
Yes, you should. Yes, you should.
Don't stall, please. Don't be the guy who's like, I'm going to look at this discard pile for 10 minutes. That is disrespectful to the player. And if you're stalling for time, that's disrespectful to everyone waiting for you. A lot of things to consider. What's in the graveyard? How many resources do they have? Have they activated X, Y, and Z? So, like, you have to look at her sideways. You can't look at her straight on and go, okay, there's nothing in their graveyard. Ezra didn't roll anything. They have no money, or they have like 1 resource. I'm safe. Because her and her deck and her toolbox.
Her toolkit is huge.
Yeah, her toolbox is full of deceptional tricks that want to lure you into a sense of security. You go, okay, they have no money, they have no cards, they rolled out, there's no damage, no big deal. And then they go, cool, never tell me the odds, and running interference on playing cards, which means you cannot, as an action, play cards, which also means they're going to resolve all that damage.
They're going to resolve everything and kill you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Sabine, Sabine almost creates this turn sequencing disadvantage for the opponent because of that toolkit, because of what she does. It doesn't allow you to sequence your round the way you ought to sequence it or you like to sequence it. She really, really screws with that optimal sequencing idea. And that may be one of the reasons why a lot of people feel that she's a bad play experience. I can understand it. Having played against a lot of Sabine, and
yeah.
I think all the Sabine players against me roll really, really well. It's always 6 damage round 1, 8 damage round 2, 10 damage round 2. It's never good. But that we can understand the frustration of that, and that's the explanation of why it is the way that it is, because she screws with your turn sequencing. It's not just that she enhances hers to such a high degree. She has the ability to screw with yours because her toolkit is very, very strong.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many other cards that work with the graveyard, but they're not as efficient.
They're restricted. They're very restricted.
That's the best way to put it. Yeah, they're significantly more restricted. Sabine's like, okay, go sideways, do a thing.
She takes a weapon. That's what she wants. She wants weapons, Turn of
And
the
she gets
Jedi's
a
blue
free-
event only. Like it's very
Yeah,
restricting.
she just gets she gets an activation, a roll, and a free opportunity to resolve. Like,
Yeah.
okay,
Nobody else
sure.
gets to activate, play a weapon, and resolve dice at the same time. Sabine gets to do all 3 actions in 1 action, and that's 2 actions,
Yeah,
but that's
and
insane. It's insanely good.
and she even counters Mill. Like, she's a hard counter to so many things. Like, if
Oh,
you vandalize
destroys
her,
Mill. She destroys Mill.
she's like the only card that goes vandalize. Okay, sure, whatever,
Yeah,
man.
she's
That's cool.
fine with discarding stuff off the table. Go for it. Sabine loves it when you get rid of her weapons.
So
So just get them right back.
So
She's a huge pain in the ass. That's for sure.
yeah,
Okay, we got 2 more to go here. Let's do Hondo.
Hondo. Oh
Hondo.
boy, this guy.
Hondo.
He is fun.
Hondo, we talked about Hondo last time I was on your show, in the terms of the complexity of his sequencing, how he allows the opponent, he forces the opponent essentially to look at their turn a little differently early on, right? How you're going to manage your resources becomes essentially the first thing that you need to worry about when it comes to Hondo, right? He's all about pay me now or pay me later. You're going to take 3 damage or you're going to give him money. What's going on here, right? He creates this player choice conundrum throughout the game. But I think early on in the game is where people sort of fumble and struggle with Hondo in a big way. And you hear all the time, well, you should just pay Hondo off early, right, or something like that, or you should pay him off. It's like, is there really one strategy to dealing with a card like that's this complex? I don't think there is.
No, that was the super generic. Like, when you're starting to play against Hondo, like, this is a good strategy to start with, and then as you play him more, you're gonna have to adapt. But
Adapt. That's the word.
that's one of the things about, like I was saying earlier, you can't just listen, read, or watch anyone. And I'm not talking about just Destiny, like Magic the Gathering, fixing your car, cooking. Like, you have to do it. You have to experience it. You have to learn. You have to make mistakes. Like, the best players in the world, the best and most experienced people are the ones who've played the most and have probably made the most mistakes. Like, they probably goofed with Hondo and they gave him the resource. And then they were like, oh, I messed up. And they were punished for it. And then in the back of their mind, they remember, okay, in this interaction, don't give Hondo the resource. Take the damage. Or, the reverse happens. They take the damage and, like, I shouldn't have taken the damage. I should have given him the resource. So, like, the more you play, the more you experience, the more, time you gain with and playing against Hondo, you're going to be able to understand when to take the damage, when to pay him, when to understand what your opponent's trying to do. Because there's a third thing that Hondo players like to do. They like to try and leverage out. They like to play Hondo in a manner that makes you as the opponent feel like you have to make a decision right now, when you really should be focused on the overall game state. So go ahead.
No, I agree. Like, he's a proactive reactive. What we talked about before. Like, you have to consider what that resource you give Hondo is going to buy for the opponent, right? Because that's essentially what he wants to do. If your opponent is tapped out of resources, they're looking to get 1 or 2 to play something on Poe as a partner, or Yoda as a partner, something like that. And most of the upgrades they're going to play in the game are going to be 2 or 3. So you have to think about the construction of decks. You have to think about the larger meta, right? He's one of those characters that sort of goes beyond just what color is he playing with, but also beyond just the game itself. You have to think about, is there a Pose Blaster in this deck, right? Is there a light bow in this deck? What am I worrying about that person playing on that unactivated character who's partner to Hondo right now this turn, and how is it going to affect not only the rest of the round, but the rest of the game if I let them have this one resource that they wouldn't have been able to generate otherwise? Because perhaps if he hasn't rolled a disrupt, he's rolled a focus and a discard, or a focus and a special. Well, they feel they can fish. They're fishing for a resource. What are they going to do with it, right? You got to ask yourself the question, what are they going to do with that resource? So there's not one answer of, well, just don't pay them off early or pay them off early. It's not like that. It's not like that at all. And things like hand knowledge is going to help you sequence your turn out against Hondo probably more effectively than a lot of other characters on this list.
Yeah, Hondo's a weird one because you have to account for the maximum damage ceiling of the deck without those cards ever actually being on the table.
It's a difficult play to make in the situation, that choice to take all 6 or take 3 and give up $1, or give up $2. Giving up the resource early with a full hand of cards and the opponent is, oh man, it's such a difficult choice to make. So people who make that decision, I don't blame them necessarily, because they don't know what the heck's going on inside a table. The opponent's just sitting there with a fresh hand of cards. They rolled really, really well. And things like fast hands, they can complicate the situation even more, because now you don't have a round to think about it or a turn to think about it. Now it's like immediately you got to think about whether you give me $1. You know?
And in the terms of this video, sequencing properly, a good player can use Hondo to put astronomical amount of pressure on the opponent, because even one special, that's a lot of damage. And the characters that play with Hondo, yeah, so you got like Poe, you got Yoda, they have not only impactful dice, but they also have impactful specials. So like there's a lot of things to be afraid of with the way Hondo is built, because he's always going to be pressuring you without even activating. He's pressuring you to sit on your resources, and it kind of sucks. In all the other decks in the game, you can do whatever you want with your resources. You can spend them, you can keep them, you can hold on to them and try and save them for big plays in the next round. With Hondo, you kind of have to sit and go,
every round, every single round.
Yeah, because if you
really annoying.
If you commit too early, if you say, all right, I'm going to put this 2-cost upgrade on my guy. All right, Hondo now says I do 3 damage if I roll a special. And there's not much you can do about it unless you roll a resource and resolve a resource. But that means you have to spend 1 action to roll it, spend 1 action to resolve it, and you're probably going to be behind the curve if Hondo has fast hands, because he just rolls and resolves.
Yep.
Even if he doesn't have fast hands, he can roll and pressure. There's a lot. There's so many things that happen without Hondo ever activating. And then once he has activated, you have to like sequence your stuff to be like, do I keep my resources for removal? Do I use my resources to put like weapons on the table to damage Hondo, to shut him out? Like, what do I do? So it's very interesting how Hondo impacts your sequencing with just by being on the table. Like, not even activating, you have to worry about what's going to happen. How do I deal with this? How do I interact with these specials?
Yeah.
What do I do?
Yeah, he's a huge pain in the ass, just like Sabine, But it sucks that he affects your turn sequencing in such a significant way. You have to hold back, see what happens, right? You have to be on a reactive side with Hondo a lot of times, and some people don't like playing that way. They like to play fast. They like to play hard, and Hondo kind of forces you to play at a certain level, of certain pace, and you have to be able to sustain that. If you can't, you lose.
He's a lot of fun. Very complicated.
It is very complicated. Yeah. It wasn't surprising to see him topping at the regionals earlier in the 2018. So, but another character who is also deeply complex is one you want to talk about a lot was Kanan Jarrus, actually. And that's why we saved him for last, because Kanan's turn sequence, he can do some crazy stuff with turn sequencing. It seems so simple. Before you take an action, resolve one of the die.
That's one of his dice. One of his dice. Not his upgrades.
One of this die. One of his character die. It seems so simple, once again, right? But it's not, because there's so many things that you can do.
You keep saying that word.
And like bring the before on there, right?
Yeah.
So tell us why is he so deep and complex, Yugi?
There are so much.
We talked about so many of these in the pre-show too.
So I'm gonna go backwards a little bit. A big skill for any player is being able to look at the dice that are on the table and read it like a Tetris game. So if you ever played Tetris, you've got the pieces on the board, you've got the piece that's dropping slowly, and then it'll show you the piece coming. Some games it'll show you the next 2 pieces. So that's important because Kanan does the exact same thing with your dice. A lot of players, once again, this goes back to that tunnel vision, they go and look at what's on the table, and they mentally think about what can be resolved in this single action. And what Kanan does is he breaks that, and he goes, okay, I can do 2 things in 1 action. And if you, as the defending player, aren't reading the dice properly, he can kill you real fast before you even know it. In the terms of sequencing, Kanan like really pushes the limit because you have to know what is on the table and what could be on the table. So, and you have to understand the math. You have to understand his effect, because without looking at it, you might very easily go, okay, there's 2 melee, no big deal, I'm fine. But you have to sit for a quick moment and go, what is actually showing on these dice? What is on this table here? What am I dealing with? Mm-hmm. And that's what makes Kanan so interesting, is because his sequencing, as the Kanan player, you open up a freedom that really doesn't exist in Destiny. You can roll a lot of stuff, and you have the freedom to resolve 2 things. Now, I'm not talking about dice. I'm saying you have basically two actions built into one. You get you get like a 2-for-1.
Yep.
One of those actions must be resolved in one of his die.
But you could play an event, you could play support, you could tap an action support. Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can do.
His card isn't just a flat, like, you get 2 actions, I'm awesome. It's, you have to resolve one of his dice and then do a thing. So once his dice are off the table, you no longer get that. But because this is one of the other situations where having mixed dice is very beneficial, because your opponent can get very greedy or very confused, especially if you have a lot of weird sides showing. If you focus, like if you sequence Kanan right, and you roll out a bunch of hodgepodge, and people are like, I don't really know what's going on, you can kind of play to that, and maybe sometimes activating your other character is beneficial, because they look at Kanan's dice and his upgrade, and they're like, there's nothing threatening here, so I'm not afraid, so I don't really care. So then you're like, all right, cool. But if you're showing some threatening dice that they don't value, so for example, disrupt and a focus, your opponent might say, okay, I'm worried about the focus, I'm not worried about the disrupt. Roll out their guys. Roll out a character. Activate a character. You could focus and then do a thing if you needed to. You could disrupt them, because a lot of people don't respect the disrupt symbol. A lot of people see that and feel like, oh, they're probably going to reroll it for damage.
That's a reroll.
Yeah, oh, it's a reroll, no big deal. But if they're banking on that, you could turn off a lot of stuff. If they only had 2 resources, now they only have 1. Now you can mathematically be aware they can't hit you with Entangle. They can't hit you with Mind Trick. They probably can't play an upgrade. They really should have played the upgrade, but they didn't. And you have a stronger economy than your opponent. Now, that's not the optimum spacing you want to be in, but it's something that you got 2 dice off the table, so your opponent can't stop you. They can't hit you with removal, and that seems good to me.
Yeah, damn right, it seems good to me. To me too. Yeah, I love Kanan. Again, not surprising how far he was able to go after people sort of figured him out, how good he was, because he sort of shortens your turn in a sense, right? You never really have to use more actions than you need to with Kanan. You can kind of want to resolve just about every side on that die. You kind of like them all. And I agree with you. Disrupt, not respected enough. And for blue character having disrupt, that's very rare. So that's something that, again, people should look at taking advantage of.
Yeah. The most common thing with Kanan is very, very much the mixed damage. Like, yeah, he's very deceptive in that. Like, that's really a strong point, is even though he's not showing damage, he can be showing lethal damage. You just don't know it yet. Yeah. So that's really where you have to work out. But the more complex sequencing of Kanan is messing with your economy and bolstering the Kanan player's economy. That's where it gets very, very deceptive.
All right. Well, we spent an hour and a half talking about characters, and I hope that you guys, you're like, wow, yeah, long time. So we are going to tackle the next section, which is actually talking specifically about a lot of different turn sequencing, like not only elements, but just advantages of going first, second, action management, archetype differences, stuff like that we're going to talk about. So stay tuned. We're going to be right back. All right, now that character's in the bag, we are going to spend some time talking to you all about some factors that go into making the decision on what to actually do on your turn, right? So this is sort of the real deal, the meat and potatoes of stuff. So get your notepads out, start scribbling, take screenshots, whatever you guys want to do.
Right.
And we're going to start by talking about the advantages of going first. And I'm going to go with the first one here. And it's a topic that I've actually talked about a lot in previous videos. And it's about claim pressure and claim tension. And, you know, you've got some battlefields in the game that you really want to have, right? And so going first in your turn means that you've gotten to choose, in the beginning of the round, you've gotten to choose your battlefield. And that can be really important because when you're talking about playing the game from an aggressive position, okay, from going first, that is going to allow you to always be on the offensive, right? And being on the offensive is, well, if your deck is an offensive deck, can be really, really important. And that's not to say that mill and discard decks don't want to go first, because they like going first too, right? While they are very defensive decks by nature, they kind of like being able to do what they do quicker and get through their rounds faster, because their battlefields are also really important too. But claim pressure and claim tension becomes a huge advantage of going first when it comes to turn sequencing, because you are going to get through your round and through your game plan just a little bit faster in some cases than your opponent will be able to. And that's going to start to put them on the back and say, either I take this action or I claim, so that I can go first next round, and then I can flip the table on someone. And that can change your sequencing for the next round. So I guess you can take it away from here, Sugi. Let's see what you think about some of the advantages of going first.
Promise I'm listening. I heard a cat. I'm like,
I saw your cat in the last time. She was behind you before.
sleeping right behind me. I was like, oh, okay, there you are. So, cats aside, the ability to go first has a lot of things that can be good and sometimes bad. So the bad is it's not as common, but if you're in a mirror match, like say Talzin versus Talzin, and you go first, it's kind of tricky, because if you use Talzin, your opponent's probably going to counter you with their Talzin. So you probably want to go second. Now, that's not to say you should go second, but you probably want to go second. You may want to go first, or you may need to go first to pressure removal or pressure them to waste their activation on you. So there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to going first. But kind of like what Rebel Gray was saying, if you go first, first of all, the biggest thing is you have the battlefield, which does proc a lot of special effects of, only play this if you have the battlefield, do a thing. So the game is inherently designed to reward players who have the battlefield on their side. So that is something that your deck may be able to take advantage of. It might not be able to take advantage of, but that is something you should be aware of. Is if you look at, Lobot, Dug In, stuff like that, the game rewards owning the battlefield with really good events, very powerful effects, very good, like Lobot gets Guardian, all kinds of things happen, if you have the battlefield. So I foresee in the future having the battlefield on your side is going to be very useful, and it's probably going to turn on a lot of things that would be way undercosted if you didn't have the battlefield. Going first puts pressure on your opponent, because you, as the first player, like getting the first action of the game will really dictate the pace of the turn. So if you have a fully loaded up character, Seven Sister is the most popular right now. So if you've got a fully kitted out Sister or a Boba, whatever, you're running a heavy aggro deck, and you activate that character, you've done a couple things. First of all, obviously you've activated the character, but you're rolling out your big beefy person, and if you get a lot of damage, your opponent now has to deal with it. If they don't deal with it, they probably, once again, like we said earlier, they probably don't have removal. If they do deal with it, you slow down their economy because they have one less card. That's not the most important thing, but they have one less resource. Lots of cards in the game that you need to get on the table. All of your upgrades, all of the really good ones, generally cost one resource. I'm sorry, they cost two resources. If you only have one resource, you can't play them, which means you have to expend cards like Well Connected or Truce to get that resource you desperately need. That falls back into not a great place. You're on the back pedal now because you're taking actions you didn't want to take just to stay up to the same pace as your opponent. Your opponent rolled out, dealt damage. What are you doing? You're creating resources.
You're trying to make money.
Yeah, you're trying to make money. You're trying to just get this card on the table. You're just trying to roll out your stuff while they're just like, roll, damage, cool. It's not as simple as that, but that's basically what's happening. When you start to, once again, astral project, pull yourself out and you go, all right, they pressured me with a lot of damage. Do I take the damage and return fire? Like, is your damage ceiling higher than the damage that they have? Can you outpace them? Is it worth keeping the resource to deal more damage? Is it worth removing their dice to try and come back? Like, what is the give and what is the take? So none of that really happens if your opponent doesn't go first with a loaded up character. If you get to go first, you get to dictate what happens because you can just roll out your thing or activate your support, or you get to set the pace of what's going to be happening because you're the first person to do something. So there are advantages. Once again, there's disadvantages because if you go first and you roll out really well and you roll out like, 2 3s, you get hit with easy pickings and it feels really bad. Okay, that is true too. Like there are, there's give and take to I get to go first. I can set the pace of the game. Also, if I go first, I can get hit with removal faster. Something to think about.
Yeah. You also had mentioned, the way I sort of summarized that idea was like you're playing this long game. When you go first, you're always talking about setting tempo and making sure that the game is sort of in your wheelhouse. And I also like that you mentioned how many cards in the game exist now that let you take advantage or only can be played if you have the battlefield. And if you just look at just the legacy set, if you guys go back and look at that, there are actually a lot of cards that say play only if you have the battlefield, or when you play, take control of the battlefield, stuff like that. Or when you have the battlefield, indirect turns into ranged, right? Stuff like that with Word Team. There's a lot of interactions with the battlefield, and that can change your sequencing of turn. So pay attention to that kind of stuff because it's actually kind of important.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the advantages of going second, and you had already started to talk about that. Obviously, getting to go second in the beginning of the game allows you to take the shields, right? That one's pretty obvious. So that is where you want to be. And when we were talking about it in the pre-show, we sort of looked at going second as being the sort of response removal advantage position, right? What does that mean for players who are sort of just hearing that for the first time to actually have an advantage for, going second?
Going second.
A lot of people don't see that, right? But it changes your turn sequencing, puts you on a back foot. And we looked at it kind of as like this reactive position, this tempo controlling position. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So this comes from a much more control player aspect. So if you're playing aggro, it's probably not as advantageous for you, but it's still valid. Something to think about. When you're going second, you get the shields. Like the game has been built where you basically get +2 health. You get some sustainability. You get the ability to live longer because they have assumed that your opponent is going to roll damage, which means they're going to resolve it before you can do anything to stop it. So the way I've seen the game ever since the inception was you get the 2 shields because they assume your opponent at some capacity is going to roll 2 damage and resolve it, and there's not much you can do about it with the exception of using your removal pieces. Now, sometimes it's worth taking the damage, letting the shields do what they were meant to do, and using those resources for upgrades. But we're not talking about that. But there's things to consider. So, I guess we kind of are. So going second, the way I've seen this in my head is when you're going first, you control the tempo of the damage of the game initially.
Okay, I can see that.
That can swing between players. But if you're going first, you have the higher chance to control how damage is dealt and where damage is dealt. If you're going second, I feel like you have the ability to control the economy of the game because you can use your removal events to get rid of dice. You can choose to let your shields remove the dice, which means that's less damage you have to deal with, less dice you have to impact. And if you have removal in your hand, that means later in the game, if someone rolls out a god roll, you can use that to just shut that out, as opposed to early game where, maybe they roll like 2 or 3 damage. Well, if your guy has 2 shields on him, they get rid of 2 dice, you only take 1 damage, you're okay. They probably expended some of their best dice for turn 1, and you didn't expend anything. So you have a little bit of economy advantage, I would feel, because you still got all of your dice, you've still got all of your resources, you've still got all of your cards in your hand. If they decided to discard a reroll, that's 1 less card in their hand, 1 less option, so on and so forth. So you can use your game state or board state to dictate where the economy of the game is because dice are a part of economy. So if your opponent just rolls out the nuts and you're looking at 6 damage from a Sabine, and they don't have ambush, thank God, for some odd reason. Well, hey, how about into the garbage chute? 1 resource getting rid of 6 damage. That feels pretty good. Now,
Every time.
you do lose a die from that character you didn't activate, but was that die going to stop 6 damage in the first place? No, it was not. So you're trading your economic value of, okay, they activated, they lost 2 dice. You lost a resource and a card and a die. I feel that 6 damage is worth that. Now, if you're like looking at 3 damage, you have to make an assumption. You have to make an educated decision, because sometimes it's worth stopping the 3 damage, sometimes it's not. And only when you play the game a lot will you have the experience to understand when and where that's a valuable decision.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into the next section about action management, And the first sort of idea there is knowing when the most impactful moment to play a card is, and also when to hold on to a card, right?
Yeah.
There are going to be times where you can use garbage shoot for 1 die. If you absolutely need to, yeah, you can. It sucks, but there are times in the game where you may need to do that.
Yep.
Right.
There are some weird. This is where the weird stuff comes in. This is my favorite part. So action management is there's things you want to do and there's things you need to do. And a good Destiny player or any player for any card game will, as they play the game more and more and more, they will begin to learn the difference between those two. Because as you start playing the game, it's very easy to see something. You're like, I want to do that thing. Like, for example, your opponent rolls out 4 damage. I want to get rid of that damage. Okay, that's true. You want to get rid of it.
It's instinct.
But that's actually very true. It is instinct. So you see 4 damage, you're like, no, I don't want that. I want to get rid of it. But do you need to get rid of it, or do you need to put that upgrade on the table and let the shields you have absorb the damage showing? Mm-hmm. That is something you have to consider in your action management, because it's easy to manage. It's easy for your brain to be like, action, remove those dice, easy pickings. Okay, sure.
Yep.
Easy. That's the easy path. Or garbage chute. Pay the $1, throw the garbage chute on the table, tap your guy. Super easy. That is like straightforward, boom. And sometimes you do need to do that. Sometimes you actually need to manage your damage as a resource. Like in my head, damage is a resource I don't get to control. I just get to choose how much I take. So I don't get to pick where it goes, because the opponent goes, all right, 4 damage to the guy over there, girl over here, whatever. But I do have some influence on how much actually stays on my character. And I do get to pick some of those dice and how they're resolved. If I have removal, I can say, okay, sure, you can deal damage to me, but you're not dealing the 4 damage on those 2 sides that have 2 damage. I'm going to get rid of that. I'll take 3, that's fine, but not 7. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you look at damage as a resource and the fact that until your character is dead, they're a damage sponge. If you have a Yoda with 10 health, they have 9 health to play with. You have 9 damage tokens you can absorb before it really matters. So when you're doing action management and your opponent rolls out 4 damage, the first thing I think to myself, is that lethal? No. The next thing I think to myself is, the rest of the dice on the table, can it become lethal? Can those 4 get an extra like +3 from somewhere I don't see right now? Mm-hmm. Is there a card? Is there a play? Is there a focus? Is it Kanan? Is there a way for them to turn the dice that are currently on this board into lethal? Yes or no? If it's yes, you need to probably remove those dice so you don't die. If it's no, I personally say, sure, I'll just take 4 damage to the face. I basically have a card in my hand that says, for 0, remove 2 dice, deal the damage to a character. Now, I know they might throw it on a character you don't want, but I mean, like, in my head, like, removing 2 dice and not losing a character is still removing 2 dice. Like, that's
dice. And there, of course, in making the proper selection of what you're going to do, there's board state to consider. What round are you in? What are your other characters' health at? There's a lot of things that are going on. How many?
Do you have shields?
Do you have shields? Have you already played one easy picking, or is this the first one you're going to play? Is another one in your deck, right?
Yep. Can you heal it off with like a mend or a field medic or a medical droid?
Is that going to come up? Is that in your, So there's a whole lot of things that are actually, that go into that decision making process that have to be weighed against the everything else that you're going to be doing, right? So making that proper selection is really at the core of good turn sequencing, essentially, And that is a skill that we're talking about this big concept overall in the video, but you got to practice it. You got to see how it's going to play out, right? And in some cases where Sugi's going to take that 4, and I may, if I'm playing a discard deck, I may want to try to find a way to turn those dice or do something like Jar Jar, right? Screw them up to make them force a reroll, right? So this context of the situation is going to be different per game and per turn and round. So all that has to be weighed against what is the best option to make for this turn, because your turn isn't just necessarily remove those dice. You have a lot of options you could take. You could just ignore those dice if you know that they're going to reroll. You know, if they're telling they're already putting that card in their discard because they're getting greedy. Okay. Then do something else. Play an upgrade you want to play, spend your resources, take another character out, put some shields on the table with a card, whatever you're going to do, resolve a resource, whatever. You have a free turn, essentially, if that's what your opponent's going to do, right? If they're telling you that's what they're going to do.
Yeah.
You know, there's an interesting turn sequencing selection thing that I saw a lot with the Obi-Maz deck specifically, and I put it in here because I really want to talk about it. A lot of people who start playing Obi-Maz, they roll out Obi, and they roll out Maz because they want to use that Maz activated ability every single time to maximize its effect. And the problem with that is, if you start every round with 2 resources, you're not going to be able to play the best upgrade you want on Obi because they're all 3s. All those lightsabers are costing you 3, right? So think about the pro and the con versus I'm going to definitely get 3 damage out of Obi because you're only going to be able to focus and then resolve a 3. Or do I roll in Maz to get a resource first, then play an upgrade on Obi, and then roll him? And in a lot of cases, that's the better play, even though it's not effectively using Maz to do damage necessarily, right? This isn't the old Poe Maz kind of style stuff, right? This is a different kind of deck, right? You can win doing 3 and then maybe more damage nickel and diming over time. Maz for generating resources is the better play for her in that particular round. So that's just an example I wanted to point out because see a lot of people do that, and it really bothers me because I'm like, you just rolled out a naked Obi. Like, what was the point of that, right? Like, you don't have a lightsaber on him.
So here's something that kind of falls into that. You're telegraphing your entire turn. Yep. And that's a part of the action management you have to get better at. If that's something you run into and you're like, man, I keep losing. Or I hear players say this a lot. How do they know what I was going to do? Telegraphing is really bad. Telegraphing, if you don't know what it means, you're telling your opponent exactly what you're going to do with the things you're doing. So in this instance, they know, if you roll out Obi-Wan, they're fully aware you're going to roll out Maz. So it's in their best interest to take your Obi-Wan dice off the table. Then Maz has nothing to flip into. And you're just kind of like, that sucks. Now you're behind the curve. You're you as the Obi-Wan Maz player, if you do roll Obi, roll Maz, use Maz to, focus and resolve, like the opponent is fully aware you're trying to go for 6 damage. Like that's not even a secret. So now that they know what you're trying to do, and they know that you're not going to commit to an upgrade, they can play around that. Mm-hmm. Yep. They can use that. You basically written out on the wall. Yep.
You've railroaded their decisions, your decisions, their decisions now, right?
Yeah. And that's how you lose games. Is if you might as well just tell your opponent, all right, first action I'm going to roll Obi-Wan, second action I'm going to roll Maz, and just hope to deal damage. Then they think in their heads, okay, well, I guess I'll flank you and stop that, because good games of any card game or any board game, anything you ever play, the opponent, the players having this dialogue in their strategy. I activate Maz. Whoa, okay, that's weird. Okay, I'm gonna try and do this to play around that. You're always these are those course corrections. Back to the football analogy. You are trying to score 7 points with this play. They are trying to stop you from scoring 7 points with this play. So when you guys start to do thumb wars and butt heads, that's the interesting part of the game. If your favorite team and your favorite quarterback stands up and goes, hey, opponent's team, I'm going to throw the ball to the guy on the right. He's going to go down 10 yards and cut to the left. Well, guess what you're going to do? You're going to just shut him out. Yep. So the same thing happens. It's like the analogy works with Destiny at any card game. If you're telegraphing your turn in the way you sequence your actions, you basically did the same thing. Hey, I'm going to throw the ball on the right-hand side, and it's going to be to that guy over there. And so they go, okay, cool. Well, I'm going to use this piece of removal to stop that. I'm going to use this card to shut that down. And they're going to turn they're going to just neutralize your turn. And then they can do whatever they want because they were able to shut you out. And then they get to have the counterplay. And you're like, I can't do anything. Yeah, because they knew what you were doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is about board control. This is about decision making. You know, the football analogy is amazing, and if you want an even more concrete example of it, rolling Obi first is going to expose 2 dice to the opponent, which can be removed in a lot of different ways, right? And then you're going to roll Maz out, and she's going to pluck one of those dice off the table. Probably if she rolls a focus, she's got a 56% chance to do it. So now you're only leaving your opponent 1 die to have to deal with. They didn't want to deal with 2, now they're going to have to deal with 1. If you roll Maz first, you can resolve both her dice, possibly for a resource immediately with a flip and resolve. Then you're going to play a lightsaber out on Obi-Wan if you've got that in your hand. Now when you roll him in, you're making your opponent deal with 3 dice. That's a lot better than them dealing with 1 die.
Pressure.
So think about, right, that's a pressure play. So think about that in terms of sequencing. And that's one deck to look at, but there's obviously a lot of different decks that do things like Dice Flood. And Dice Flood is about that too. It's about board control, forcing your opponent to say, I have to select which dice I'm going to pluck off the table because there's so many to choose from, I can only deal with 2. Once you get to that 3, you know you're going to get something out of something, right?
Yeah. Don't telegraph. Don't get greedy. Don't telegraph.
Yeah, don't telegraph.
Just don't do that.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the archetype differences, right? And the first one to really cover is, I guess, mill and discard, right? And mill and discard obviously wants to play the game a little bit differently. It's one of the archetypes that's super duper comfortable playing with that second turn advantage, right? It wants shields. It has tons of removal. It loves to be reactive. What is it about mill that changes turn sequencing significantly compared to aggro or mid-range, the other types we're going to talk about?
You have to know everything everywhere at all times.
That's one way to put it. Yeah.
You've got to know the cards in your hand, the cards in their hand, potentially. You have to make educated decisions. You have to read your opponent so well. So you got to know the cards in their hand, the cards in your hand. You got to know the resources on your table and their table. I know this sounds stupid. But
doesn't sound stupid to me, Sugi.
But a good mill player, if you ask them at any point in the game, all right, where is this card in the game state? Is it in your hand? Is it on the table? Is it in your graveyard? Is it in your deck? If they can't answer that, it's going to be a tough time for them because you have to know where a lot of cards are and are going to be. You have to know, did your opponent play removal last turn? Are both copies of Easy Pickings in their graveyard? Is one copy of Easy Pickings in their deck or hand? Do they have the resource to play it? Is their yellow guy alive? Do they, are they potentially running a hyperspace jump? Did they just take a resource when that die could have dealt 3 damage to me? Why didn't they re-roll it? What's going on? Is there a card in their hand that they value? So you have to contemplate a significant amount of information and data that a lot of the other decks don't need because mill decks are all about sustaining and milling, which doesn't do any damage, which means all of the characters on your opponent's side are going to live the entire game. The whole thing. And they will never die, with the exception of, events that kill characters.
Yeah, maybe a planned explosion if you're, feeling great, or a crime lord on the villain side. Or on the hero side, once we get Bo-Katan coming in.
Bo-Katan!
But yeah, mill is and we're both mill players, so we both really understand this perspective here. You're not only playing your game, you're also trying to figure out the game that the opponent is playing and play against and really, really counter their game in a significant way. Aggro doesn't try to counter mill because it's typically not built for that. Mid-range doesn't counter mill. It counters aggro in the best ways that it possibly can when it can.
Yeah.
So, and combo decks, well, they come in such a variety, right? There's no real one that they specifically counter, but mill is very difficult to play because a lot of people do not understand the level of attention that needs to be played to the game, because every turn you make, every single time you take an action, it's a bit more impactful than the average deck, like aggro deck out there.
It's the most unforgiving.
It's unforgiving. You do not have as much space for error. There's not enough margin, not a lot of margin there. So it's not something that you should get into, tomorrow if you haven't already started playing it. But I made a video not too long ago, about a week or so ago, about the concepts that go into mill. And some people said, this is kind of a bland video, whatever. But If you don't understand that mindset, you're never going to know how to play against mill, and that's something that you got to know. In order to know how to sequence against mill, you have to know everything that surrounds mill. One of the things Suki said, the characters always live. That's in the video. The characters are always there, no matter what. If there's 4 of them, 3 of them, 2 of them, they're going to be there the whole game. How do you deal with that while winning, right? You have to sustain, right?
Yeah.
And so your sequencing is going to be heavily moved towards sustain, control, very comfortable playing on the back foot. In fact, that's where it loves to be. Mill slow plays. Don't worry about speed, right? Don't worry about trying to claim. The whole claim pressure thing doesn't exist for you for the most part, right? Sometimes it does late game, but early game doesn't matter, you know? Doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I never tried to claim war turn streets in round 2. It's just not happening.
The most informed player is going to do better. You may not win because there's dice, stuff happens. But when it comes to, the sequencing, you have to consider your sequencing, your opponent's sequencing, and more importantly, I think, how you as the control player are going to influence your opponent's sequencing of actions. Because if you can control them and they don't control you, you're winning the game more than likely.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how playing a card like Entrenched, 5 shields to your characters, changes your opponent's sequencing. Right? They're like, next turn I was going to resolve this and kill that dude. Now he's got 3 shields. What do I do? Do I still do that because that furthers my game plan? Do I change targets? Mill players, let me give you a little secret, guys. We love it when you switch targets. Please, switch targets. I know Rican's at 8. Now he's got 3 shields. Put 3 on the partisan. It's fine.
Stop giving away secrets. Stop that. Stop telling people that.
We should have hid it behind a paywall, right? That should have been Patreon tier, I guess.
Oh, shots fired! Oh my gosh, that is. But okay. that is a legitimate strategy. Misdirection in mill decks is very important because it is not uncommon for me to shield up the partisan and the Rican and leave Yoda naked, and they go, "Oh wow, easy target." But I haven't rolled out Yoda, so they go, "Sure, I guess I'll do 3 damage to Yoda." All right, Yoda activation, shield, flip, and they're like.
Game state has now changed.
But that is something you can this is a part of the sequencing video.
Yes.
A control player, the whole name of control is to control the game. You want to control the resources, their cards, their dice, their actions, their underwear. You want to control everything this player is doing. You want to tell them what they're supposed to eat, when to sleep, other things.
Where their damage is going. Everything. When they're going to spend their resources. Yep.
When they're going to win the game, when they're going to lose the game, they're not going to win the game, and you're going to win the game. So deal with it. That's the whole point of control, is you are controlling every aspect of the game. What a lot of people think is you're just controlling them. Realistically, you're controlling yours and theirs. You have to control your environment while controlling theirs. Making them feel like they have no control is so important. It's all if you sequence in someone. Yoda's a great example. I've done this before. I'll do Yoda with a force meditation and something else. Maybe double force meditation. And
that's a big target on his head.
I mean, it is a big target, but they feel like they're not able to do anything. They're like, oh no, he's gonna mill 6 cards. Oh my gosh, what am I gonna do? And what's really interesting is they might only have 10 cards left in their deck. I don't need to mill 6 cards out of their deck. I need to start hitting their hand. And they get greedy, and that's exactly what I need them to do, because if they play a card out of their hand to get rid of my dice, that's still
one discard.
That's one discard.
One discard.
One disrupt, and they're going to draw that card. So I hit a card from their hand, I hit a resource from their field, and I still technically hit a card from their deck when they draw up.
Yep. And now they've also, what people don't understand when you say discard, they play the resource right for the card. They play the card out of the hand, which is 1 discard effectively to you. They've also removed the die. Now you have 1 less resolution. They've just given you tempo. They've given you a little bit of action advantage, right? These are little tiny things that really are important in turn sequencing that over the long game add up to you getting closer and closer to claim, making your turn shorter. And remember also, mill, your characters are going to die. So your turns are going to become shorter and shorter as they start to run out of cards. If you can balance damage taken versus cards milled, you can just win by attrition. I have won so many games where I'm sitting there with maybe 10 health left among all my characters plus shields, and their maximum damage capability is 6. And
Yeah,
I'm
you're
like,
fine.
the game's over. Doesn't matter what you roll.
Nope.
It doesn't matter. You got no cards left in your hand. I milled you out. You cannot win this game no matter what. So it doesn't matter. We'll go to the next round. I will hyperspace you. It doesn't make a difference, right? I'll best spin the last card out of your hand. It doesn't matter. Right?
Nope.
So those are things, right? And those are a little more detailed strategies for mill that I will do in another video probably, but very important stuff. So let's talk about mid-range, because mid-range also sort of hits that spot where it's early control, ramping up.
Hate mid-range.
I can't stand it either. Don't like it. I guess, for me, a great mid-range deck is like that Isla Padawan deck.
Yeah.
I guess you could look at that as a mid-range deck, right? Although it seems to be more aggro the way that Eric builds it.
It's kind of an aggro mid-range. So, I guess I'm going to kind of cheat and jump ahead. Aggro decks are just high intensive burst as fast as you possibly can. Aggro decks have the exact same format no matter what game they're in. You're playing aggressive, high damage, fast-paced decks that want to burn you out as soon as they possibly can. The longer the game goes, the worse it is for the aggro deck, because they generally try and burn all their resources turn 1 and turn 2 in Destiny to kill a guy, and then they have the advantage, and then they just, they finish the job by turns 4 and 5. But they want to really pressure you to kill something as soon as they can turn 1 or early in the round on turn 2, so that way you have less dice on the table, you have less health on the table, they don't have to worry about a lot of pressure coming from you. It's just a lot of things. So mid-range is kind of the same thing, but it wants to ramp up, and then by turn 3 it's unstoppable. So you get to turn 3 and they have so much damage that something will pretty much die every turn, or you can get multiple kills in a turn. So going back to the sequencing for mid-range, you're going to be focusing primarily on early game building your board state. You want to get resources, you want to put out upgrades. You're not really going to be focused on mitigating damage because you're generally a 3-wide. So you've got some space to wiggle. You've got health to play around with. And if you do have removal, it's pretty efficient. So you're going to want to get your, ancient lightsabers, your Shotos, maybe even your Maul Saber, your Vibro Cutlass. Your big stuff is going to come out turns 2, setting up damage and kills for turn 3. So mid-range decks are just they have the ability to, they can control you early game and then move past you in the damage race mid to late game. But you have to sequence appropriately, because there is a deception where people think, I rolled out a bunch, like the Padawan deck. It's very deceptive to say your Padawans all roll out 1 damage size, and then Ayla rolls out double damage, and it's you don't really want to spend 4 dice to deal 4 damage.
Right.
It's not very bad.
It's not great. Yeah.
So you're trading speed for overwhelmingness. I guess quality versus quantity might be a good way to put it.
Yeah, I would say quality versus quantity. I feel like Padawan is one of the quintessential mid-range characters, just because saving that initial 1 resource to play an ancient lightsaber out is going to give you the option to either play a second weapon on the other Padawan for $1 also if you've got another 2-drop, or to free up that resource for a removal, right? Blue removal, it's a lot of stuff where you're removing dice, so things like guard, for example, but there's also mislead out there right now. So the Padawan... Garbage chute, yeah. The Padawan lets you sort of keep something in your economy to deal with, an impending threat over the early in the game. And the first 2 rounds, playing those first 2 upgrades saves you money. It allows you to ramp up, right? And then you can ramp those upgrades into bigger ones if you so choose. So there's a lot with the Padawan that is really interesting. So that's kind of why I highlighted her for this particular section. But she's not the only character that might fit well in a mid-range deck, but she certainly is the one that seems most obvious in terms of economy, being able to ramp pretty easily, and for her cost, she's pretty good. 8 for 7 health, and it's an Awakenings character that still sees play. Good job, FFG. You nailed it. You nailed it in set 1. They don't see too many Awakenings characters that still run that high up in the
not really. No, not very much.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about combo decks. All right, what's the thing with turn sequencing with combo decks? It seems pretty obvious. You want to make sure you sequence into your combo, right? But that's a lot of ways you can do that, right?
Yeah. Combo and aggro are the last 2 we're going to talk about, and they're probably a little bit more linear than the other 2. So combo has a fairly straightforward thing they want to do. So OTK is probably the most well-known combo deck. You want to 1 turn kill stuff. So how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to use cards like Leadership to, tap your guy, untap your big boss monster. You're going to use Price of Failure to kill one of your guys to untap your big boss monster. So when we're talking about combo decks, I always felt like it was Tron from Magic the Gathering. And if you've never heard that term before, it comes from the anime Voltron. So you had 2 arms, 2 legs, the body, and the head, and they would come together to form this super mecha Megazord thing, and they would punch bad guys in the face. So what that translated to in Magic was you would have this one boss monster, and you would equip it with a bunch of in Destiny terms, you give it a bunch of upgrades, you make it big, huge threat, and that was the one thing you kept alive. You'd have all these other little creatures and all these other little things, but you didn't really care. You got to keep Voltron alive, because if Voltron dies, you lose the game. But Voltron is so big and so beefy and does so many things, it's very hard to deal with. So in combo decks, it's the same kind of premise. You're going to use cards like Leadership and Price of Failure. One Turn Kill is the prime example of a combo Tron deck. You want to load up that Seventh Sister with so much stuff, and then roll her out, kill something, use Leadership, roll her out again, kill something, Price of Failure, roll her out again, kill something, and you're just boom, boom, boom. You're using that Tron fist, and you're just bam, 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 bam. So the way you sequence is you have very specific cards that combo together to make this big play. So you're looking for Balanced Ambition, you're looking for ways to untap Seventh Sister. The action sequencing is activate, do a lot of damage, untap, do it again.
Do it again.
So what's really interesting is when you have Night Sister. That is probably the most impactful sequencing of actions in the One Turn Kill deck, because Night Sister does some really terrible things to players that they don't really know she can do. If you leave Night Sister unchecked and you let her just sit there and you don't do anything, here's what else she can do. She can reroll Seventh Sister's dice and then max out the damage on Seventh Sister, deal all that damage to you, kill her off with the Price of Failure, and untap Seventh Sister.
Do it all again.
Do it all over again. And you're still sitting on 4 cards in your hand. That's the thing. Night Sister really gives you significant amounts of sequencing power, because you can just use her to fix your dice. Now, it's not guaranteed. It's not perfect. But it's still a better option than discarding multiple cards to reroll over and over and over again, where you can just go 1 damage on Sister, reroll this die. 1 damage on Sister, reroll your die. Over and over and over. Get her to 6 damage. Price of Failure. You just got 6 actions of massive value out of that character. Insane value.
Insane value. And you have to discard a card, which are key to your combo decks, right? Events are usually the key to your combo decks, so playing them in the right order is what creates that OTK deck happening, right? Price of Failures versus Leaderships versus Trust Your Instincts to reroll all blue dice and draw a card, right? To possibly draw into a piece. So that's one version of a combo deck, right? And Leadership is usually part of these combo decks.
Yep.
But there's others, and I'm sure there will be more as we go forward.
Oh,
we kind of covered aggro for the most part in terms of sequencing. Its game plan is to do as much damage as possible. That generally means play an upgrade, roll out, do damage, reroll, hit your opponent for really hard. Deviating from that, not usually. Not usually.
No, aggro. No, aggro is a very linear deck. Now, don't think when I say that it's a stupid easy
that
deck.
It's easy. It's not.
Yeah, Destiny aggro still has a lot of impactful decisions, a lot of impactful sequences, and a lot of actions you have to do well, because you as the aggro player have to retroactively play around removal. So if you're going to just go gung-ho, balls to the wall, and go activate, 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 you are feeding your opponent ways to remove your most impactful dice quickly. So you do have to activate appropriately and resolve your damage effectively. And sometimes, once again, going back to Mama Talzin, that means if you roll out a 2 and a 2, you might want to flip it to the 1. You don't really want to deal 3 damage. True. But it's better to deal 3 damage than 0 damage if they hit you with easy pickings.
Yep.
Now, of course, the argument is, what about Garbage Shoot? Yeah, okay, that's true. There's always a what if. You can get hit with Garbage Shoot, Entangle, Flank, Mislead. There's a lot of things. But it feels bad when you actively choose to use Talzin's effect to maximize your damage, and then they just take 2 dice off.
That's wasted. Yeah.
Right. It's going to make life harder for them, because here's the thing. So the reason I say that with aggro is Boba Fett is a great threat because he's got mixed damage and the special. So if you roll out mixed damage, it's going to be harder for them to remove it with easy pickings. They have to use weaker versions of removal. They can't hit you with entangle if you hit 2 guns and 2 sticks. If you hit like a special and a 2 damage, they can hit you with entangle. But still, that's 2 resources off their table, which means they're probably not playing an upgrade. If you roll out a special and something else and they don't have the removal, that's good. And that pressures them not to roll out their big guy, because if they roll massive damage, you can just swing it right back in their face, and they probably don't want to deal with it. So they're going to have to activate a weaker character, which gives you the opportunity to activate your other characters, get more dice on the table, maybe flip Boba into specials, maybe do other things. And that's part of that sequencing that, as an aggro player, it's a more control mindset, but it does affect the way the game is played out. It's not just activate Boba, deal damage, activate other character, deal damage, activate sister, like it's not as straightforward as just turn sideways and roll dice. Like there are some very important decisions to be made on how to pressure your opponent in the way they respond to you, and not just let you go unchecked.
I was going to talk about one of the things I've seen, I mentioned before in another video, like about how aggro players will tap out their resources by playing an upgrade that actually has a resource side on it. It's usually the best side on their weapon, right? They'll play an X8 sniper rifle. They can't resolve the 3-for-1, right? So if your 3-for-1 is out there and you're looking at maybe a 2 and a +2 or something like that, you are also giving your opponent the ability to say, well, I don't need to worry about that die right now. The 3-for-1, they can't pay for it. So I'm going to worry about these other die right now. And I'm going to make you work to get a resource or play a truce or something else to force a way out there. So as an aggro player, don't put yourself in a situation where the dice on the table that you just rolled are actually worthless for your opponent to remove at that particular time, because it's going to change their turn sequencing as well. So that's something that I saw a lot with emo kids decks. People would play a 2-cost upgrade on Darth Vader, roll him in, not be able to pay for his 3-for-1 side. I'm like, or like a vibro knife, right? Useless. Now you can't do it anymore. This 3-for-1 now becomes a dead die on the table, right? So consider things like that. But this section is gonna end. We're going to give you some brief tips, and we've given you so many already.
I know.
But we're gonna boil down. It's a kind of 3 main tips that we want you guys to walk away from this video with, and then we'll close it out and all that good stuff. So be right back in just a sec. All right. So in all this talking, we were able to put together a few extra tips that are sort of in-game decision stuff, and we've already mentioned probably all of these throughout the video, but we want to highlight them to make sure that you are aware of them. So the first one that I want to bring out is talking about seeing the tells. Players have these tells during a game, and they can actually assist you in sequencing your turns. We've already talked a little bit about this, where someone's hand is going towards a discard pile with a card already. You kind of know they're going to do that next. That's going to give you an idea of, it may affect what you're doing on your turn, right? Or players may be looking at their dice while you're doing stuff to be like, which ones am I going to re-roll next? What don't they like? So, for example, removing a discard die might tell you that they have a card in their hand they really want to protect, right? Because think about the example we gave earlier. If you remove 1 discard die showing, you've just given the player that discard. You've resolved it for them, but you've also disrupted yourself 1 resource. That would mean to me, you've got something in your hand you don't want me to see. You don't want me to randomly discard, right? So there are these little tells that go on in the game that are really important. Are there any that sort of come to mind, Sugi, that you think are important to highlight and that are common enough that people might see?
Yeah, keep a poker face. I can't tell you how many games I've played and someone rolls out some stuff. Or actually, I should probably reverse it. There's a lot of games where I'll roll out specials on Yoda, and they're like, man! And I'm like, you're telling me right there you can't stop me? No, there is no way a player would be like, I'm disappointed that you rolled out specials, and I have no way of dealing with it.
I'm just going to leave them there. No, absolutely not.
No, like if someone rolls out something you don't want to deal with, just stonewall. No response. Like I said, go back to lying. Like if you're not good at it, sometimes I'll just be like, all right, we're gonna deal with that right about now. And they're like, oh, really? And I'm like, maybe.
Yes,
maybe.
Going back to lying or like bluffing as needed.
Bluffing as needed.
Something really, really important.
Another big tell. This comes from Netrunner. This is another skill I learned from Netrunner. If someone's about to discard a card from your hand, do not look at your hand. Do not draw cards and be like, here's a great example. Don't do this.
Don't do this. Yes. Don't look at the card you don't want them to take.
Don't just shuffle your cards, put them face down, lay them out in front of your opponent, because I can't tell you how many times they'll be like, they'll fan out their cards, and this is what I do, and this is what they do. I'm like, all right, this one. That's the one. How did you know? And I'm like, well, I mean, like, this is what you did. I'm like, oh, well, it's obviously on this side of their hand. That's what I want. So, like, just shuffle them up. This is that information we were talking about, where you didn't say a thing, but your eyes told me everything I needed to know. Yep. Same thing with, like, if someone rolls out dice. I've seen this happen too. They've got cards in their hand. They start shuffling. You roll out your stuff. They're like, oh, okay. You just told me you got removal. And if you don't remove what I just rolled out, I can make an educated guess on what you have. So if you're running blue hero and you go, you start shuffling your hand, and I roll out some sticks, and you're playing a cane, and you go, okay. Like, you start fiddling with this card in your hand, you're like, oh, and you put this, all right, okay. You keep looking at that card. I know you've got removal.
Similarly, all these tips can be used to make your opponent think what Sugi is saying. So, awesome. And again, the reason we bring this up is because of turn sequencing specifically, right? Knowing that your opponent has removal, or knowing that they're bluffing removal, on the other hand, can help you say, well, I don't need to resolve these dice immediately. I know that they're safe for now. So I can do something else, rather than saying, well, I have to sort of piecemeal my turn and resolve Yoda's die all first, and then not be able to flip anything else other than what's in his pool from activating, and then work on the next character, right? So those are the important. That's why bluffing is very important to bring up, as far as not only as a meta mechanic, but just as something that it can really literally help you affect your turn sequencing. Yeah. So the last one is one you've said probably a dozen times already or more in this video, and it's don't get greedy. And I want to talk right now, because I know you've said a lot about it already, but there's one thing I want to mention, and it's this. Hero vehicle players.
Oh,
I love you guys. I love you guys. All right? I love you guys because I basically win almost every game against you because I play Mill. But the reason that I beat you is because you are trying to roll out all your dice and then trying to discard one card, which I get, to re-roll 8 dice.
You roll 8 dice.
I get it. I understand. But what you're doing is you're letting me get a resource to hyperspace jump you or retreat you. And what you should be doing, and also easy pickings you, what you should be doing is you roll damage, resolve that die. Yeah. You roll damage again, resolve that die. And I've literally taught this to people in my store. I call it nickel and diming your opponent. Nickel and dime the shit out of me, because you don't need to optimize your turn. This is where all the rules we just talked about are thrown out the window, right? Optimizing turn sequencing and considering all these things. If I know you want to maximize your reroll. I get it, okay? But the moment you do that and you've discarded the card I want, or you're discarding 2 cards or 3 cards to make that happen, I'm just waiting to hyperspace jump you to end the round, or do something that will affect your rounds in a significant way. Nickel and dime your die resolutions. Take 30 actions this round. It doesn't matter. I will definitely claim it doesn't matter, right? And we're talking about, this is the end game for hero vehicle decks. They do this all the time, and it's because it's a situation that breaks the rules at its heart. Yeah. And you don't want to maximize your reroll. You actually just want to do whatever you can get and keep the cards that you have and not discard them. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, something
I've taught you guys out there.
Yeah. Right. I guess another tip from Mill, like you're translating damage into cards. So you have to understand that I don't care about your damage. I care about your cards. You can deal a lot of damage potentially, but if you don't kill me, it doesn't matter. That's the beauty, is if you're not winning the game, you're losing. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's kind of one of those, I don't know, it's a bizarre thing to say, because you would think, well, I'm not winning. Yeah, but you might also not be losing. Like if they're not showing lethal damage, nobody's winning, nobody's losing. Right. But if they're showing lethal damage, they're winning and you're losing. So you're trying to keep the game state at no one's winning, and then you're winning, which means they're losing. So, I mean, like, that is another video to talk about, because that statement is excessively more complicated than what I just made it out to be. Yes. But going back to don't get greedy, there are a lot of times in the game where you're going to roll out dice and not get what you want. And there are points where you do have to make sacrifices with the options in your hand versus what the dice are telling you. But if you get rid of really potent options you need and you re-roll and you get the same thing, and you discard a card, and we're not, okay, I guess I should clarify. If this isn't lethal, killing, game-winning damage, and you roll out double resources, and you pitch a card, and you roll double resources again, if you pitch a card and you get worse than double resources, you are vastly hurt yourself. Now, I know that there's the odds and the math of, I can roll damage, and I should roll damage, but sometimes the universe is telling you, take the 2 resources and move along. That is not easy to determine, but sometimes you don't want to go past the point of no return, because now you're pitching valuable cards you need to win the game for dice that aren't winning you the game. And you have to be really careful, because if you have like 1 or 2 win cons in your hand and you're trying to pitch them for damage that's not going to win you the game, I have to stress this. I've seen way too many players try and push the damage race or tie the damage race. And they're like, I'm going to get rid of this ancient lightsaber. I'm like, why would you do that? Just lose the damage race and take the 2 resources and play the lightsaber. Like, you can use the action later to heal for 2. Well, I needed this damage so I could pressure you next turn. No, you needed that card to pressure me for the whole game, not a single turn.
That's right.
So you have to make assessments for, if your dice aren't giving you what you want, maybe you should just take, once again, don't get greedy. Players get way too greedy. They pitch out their entire hand. They spend all their actions, all their resources to try and get, 4 damage. And the odds are just not in their favor. And they could go to the next turn and do it with the cards in their hand.
Correct, because they're going to get a whole fresh level of activation. Everything's going to activate. So the reason it's called Don't Get Greedy is because regardless of whether you're going for 5 damage or 10 damage, it's always greedy. And so it's never a good idea to do it, ever. 0% of the time.
Yeah.
It's very rare that it will win you the game. When it wins you the game, it feels amazing. But more often than not, you're not going to win.
No.
It's going to be bad.
No. And Zach Bunn said something like that on one of our podcasts. Like, the human mind tends to remember, like, the good things that happened over, like, the regular or the bad. And so you have to be careful that you don't remember that one game 6 months ago where you discarded all your cards and you god rolled the final damage you needed to win the game. And you're like, that's my strategy, that's what I'm going to do. But you neglect to recall that, the last 4 or 5 times you did it, you didn't win the game.
Yeah.
So, like, it is important to remember, like, some things you do that are impactful will win games. But don't, like, lean on it as your main form of victory. Like, remember, this did work, but the odds aren't in my favor. And sometimes you need to remember the math does outweigh the need. So, once again, what do you want? What do you need? I want to win right now. I want to do it, but you need to win the game overall total. So, like, will you win the game now? Probably not. Will you win the game next turn? More than likely. Go for the need, not the want.
All very good tips, Sugi. All right, we're going to close this thing out right now.
All right.
All right, folks. I hope now that you've had a big, and I mean big, heaping spoonful on this topic, that you are ready to go out there and apply this newfound knowledge in all of your games. I think I actually learned a lot myself today. I know I'm sitting here hosting this whole thing and it's going on my channel, but, it's just, this is one of those people that think about content creator. It's this thing that people think about content creators is that we have all this knowledge, and so we also must have all the answers. But I know that I don't. And just sitting here chatting with you has actually taught me a lot of stuff. And I already knew a lot about this topic. I feel like I now know way more about this topic than I did going into it. And I was staring at the script for like a week and a half. So it's like so much stuff that I didn't learn. So now that we come to the end of it, are there any sort of last thoughts you have before we get out of here, Sugi?
Yeah, when I said play Netrunner, I really sincerely did mean it. That when I came from Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh, like, there's a very specific mindset of how you play a card game. You run your math, you run your numbers, you balance your cost curve, you take risks, but you try and offset that with your deck building. A lot of stuff everyone has talked about in every card game ever. Netrunner was a game that, in my opinion, took all of that information and said no. And it turns everything on the side, because you can have all of the resources, all of the answers, all of the cards, and you can still lose the game, because if your opponent makes better decisions than you and has more information than you, they're more than likely going to win the game, and usually they did. And you could play reckless, you could play wise, but the thing was, if you made the proper choices and you made risky plays, you had a better advantage to win the game, because you could pressure your opponent, you could pressure cards in their hand, their deck, their field. Like, you could do all kinds of things that would spread your opponent so thin. And that helped me to drop a lot of the fears I had in traditional CCGs, because you're taught to be afraid of pressure. You're taught to be afraid of threats, and you're also taught to deal with them appropriately. But it's instilled in high-level players, like, you need to fear this card, you need to fear this play, you need to be aware of it, deal with it, respect it. But Netrunner is like, you need to do all those things too. But if you just do insanity plays, like, you can still win. And that removed the fear. So now it's like, oh, they're showing a lot of damage. All right, here's the better question. Am I dead? No. Do I lose the game? No. Okay, deal me all that damage. I'm not losing. I'm fine.
Yeah, I think playing other games is great for giving people perspective like that. You know, like when to know, because a lot of people who start playing any game, like especially like Destiny, get very anxious. There's a lot of anxiety provoking moments. There's damage that's going to do damage, but it's not going to kill you. Don't worry about it. It's okay.
Right.
You deal with it. What you can deal with it, and if you can't, then you make up for it next round. Maybe. I mean, who knows? Sometimes it's luck of the draw, right? Who knows? But
yeah.
I think that's good advice.
I'm not going to say, like, you should just sit there and twiddle your thumbs and go, oh, I'm not dead, I'll take it to the face. Like, the reason I say that is because I see a lot of new players, and the opponent rolls out minimal to mid-range damage. So let's say you're playing a deck that on that turn can output 8 damage, and the opponent rolls 3 or 4, and they immediately go, remove that, get rid of it, just go, bye, see you later. And they drop their easy pickings, they drop their entangle, they drop their garbage chute. They're like, okay, it's gone. Whew, pressure off. Okay, I'm good. Seems good. And then, like, the next turn, they're like, oh, I can't play my upgrades. I can't do anything. And it's like, oh no, what happened? What did I do? What went wrong? Well, you might have been better off just taking the damage and then putting stuff on the table and swinging back.
Yeah, and my hope is that, you know, if someone gets through most of this video, or, you know, the big beefy parts are in the middle there, that they're going to learn how to avoid being in those situations, whether they're a new player or an advanced player. So that's really what the really big important part of this video was. But before we wrap up here, I also want to mention, you know, for the channel, that there's already another couple of videos in the pipeline. Okay, I've got that one that I mentioned last time on the wonderful world of Mill. I think Sugi's going to like that one once I get it out there. And there's another one on the elements of being successful in Destiny 2. And it's kind of funny because when we were teasing out the concept for this video exactly, you were already talking about all these things, you know? And I was like, I've already got a whole nother script on that video. We can't include all of that stuff in here. So, because it was already so long, so I'm glad that we didn't. But obviously, you know, you're like a fountain of wisdom, and people are going to want to know where they can find you. So for those that don't already know, where is that, Sugi?
So you can find me in Orlando, Florida. I live right down the street from a Cool Stuff Inc., but I'm not going to tell you where or when.
I will find it.
Oh, shh. And when I say right down the street, we're talking in LA terms, so that's nowhere near.
Oh, okay. I won't find you then.
I'm not even.
I'll wait in the store for you to come in, and then I will follow you home.
Okay, sure.
I know what the inside of your living room looks like now.
Yeah. Yeah, anything that's within 45 minutes is like, that's close. Because in LA, oh Lord, 45 minutes is like short run. Anyways, so you can find me on Knights of Ren. We have a team with Nick Obi, Rick, Todd, Jay. We've got a lot of great people who are part of the Knights of Ren. Realistically, everyone who listens is a Knight of Ren. We are all a part of the same community, playing the same game. Like, no one is better than anyone else. We're all humans playing a game. Like, it's community. That's what we love about Destiny, is the community is so fun. So if you want to find us, if you're enjoying my hat or the things we're talking about, we are on the Knights of Ren podcast. You can find us on Facebook at Knights of Ren podcast. On other social media like YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, it's KOR podcast, because you can't type out Knights of Ren for whatever reason. But, you know, we've got a weekly podcast We do articles, we do videos, we have a Patreon that more or less is just there to support us. It's not really there to make money because, we want to invest back into the community, not, turn this into a money-making business of any kind. So we just really want to talk to you. That's our whole shtick, our whole goal, our whole foundation is to just be a resource to the community. If you got questions, send us a PM. If you want to know about this deck, send us a PM. I mean, we're more than happy to answer questions and provide feedback. That's what we love to do, is talking to people and growing the community. That's what's most important to me personally, because there's so much to this game that we could talk about. We could talk for days about all of the things, but without people who are open and available, I feel like, any game will not be as successful. So yeah, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd be more than happy to talk to you about Destiny any day of the week.
Excellent. So there you have it, folks. I'm going to make sure to link all that stuff in the show notes below in the video here. And before I go, of course, I want to thank you, Sugi, for not only pitching this great idea to me, but pushing me outside of my comfort zone to actually do this collaboration. It was fun, and maybe we'll do it again sometime. Maybe I've been on your podcast a bunch of times. I usually do solo short form video, right? And here we are making this 2+ hour thing, right? But
I mean, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun. I love talking about this game, and I love your analytical approach and the way you're trying to educate people, because it goes back to what we're trying to do. It's easy to just tell people stuff, but if you're working with showing people all of the plays, all of the things they can do, it really opens up a lot of light bulbs, and then each individual person can take whatever information they listen to and apply it to their play style, and then they can evolve their decks, their playing, whatever they want. And so it's not just me telling you, do 1, do 2, do 3, you win the game. It's you as a listener evolving with us, because as you were talking, I was learning, and as I'm talking, you're learning. And I'm sure as someone else drops a comment, people are going to drop comments and say things we weren't even thinking of. It's oh my gosh, that's another way we can use Kanan. That's another pairing for Tarkin. And that's the biggest thing. We're all building each other up to grow together. So we're all becoming better players at the same time, not just me getting better and you just sitting there. It's we're all, leveling up. And that's the cool thing about these things. So
that's right.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Man, thanks for having me. Yeah, this is definitely a channel where we're trying to teach you how to fish, not give you fish. So, all right, guys. So remember, keep your droids clean of carbon scoring and always support your local moisture farm. And until next time, you want to do this together, Sugi? 3, 2, 1.
May the force be with you.